Good morning, everyone. My name is
Tiffany from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Good evening to all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aparna Gupta, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Straus Institute for Dispute Resolution here at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law. Today's symposium is ADR at the Roots, Exploring Diversity and Equity in Our Field. It is so wonderful to see so many students, friends, colleagues, and faculty today. We've missed you. In December last year, we hosted a youth summit to connect middle and high school students with conflict resolution skills and practitioners. And in one of those sessions, a young person reminded us that mediation's roots actually trace back to the time of the civil rights movement, when communities sought a constructive model to resolve disputes and minimize the prospect of violence. And while that time seems so long ago, nearly 60 years have passed since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the divisions and violence we continue to witness month after month, day after day, call on us as lawyers, leaders, and professionals to do something, to act. Our profession does not sit in a vacuum. The seeds from that summit, I'm proud to say, have led us to today's symposium, where we connect back with the movement for social change and justice and examine points where our field can make interventions in scholarship and in practice. We are so grateful that you are here. Really, we are so grateful. After the year we have all traveled together, after Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others, you are still here. We are still here. We are so thankful to our speakers and panelists for sharing their wisdom, insights, and passion today with our community. And it will truly take all of us to advance our shared values of peace, justice, equity. In the famous words of Amanda Gorman, our newest poet laureate, for there is always light if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it. So I'm so excited to illuminate some of these themes and some of these actions with you. A couple of quick reminders before we get started. There'll be plenty of time for audience questions and answers. So please mute yourself during the moderated portion of the panels or send questions through the chat. We'll be monitoring it and make sure we get to them. And we will also be recording the event for those of you who could not join us today. Let us begin. I would like to start by introducing you to Professor Sukhsimranjit Singh, who serves as the Judge Danny Weinstein Managing Director of the Straus Institute and also directs our LLM program. Professor Singh is an international mediator who has successfully resolved disputes across the world. His practice, teaching, and scholarship focus on cross-cultural dispute resolution, faith-based mediation, and utilizing modern theories, science, and technology to devise creative solutions to global challenges. Professor Singh, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, namaste, sat sri akal, adab to everybody. So nice to see you. And I am so excited to be with you today. Thank you, Aparna, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for that you joined us today and blessed us with your presence. I want to express my deep gratitude to our distinguished speakers, that you all know who they are, for sharing their incredible insight, wisdom, and time with us today. And doing so in a time where, to some varying degree, we all feel exhausted by the pandemic, by the inequality in our society, and by the polarization. Today, we hope together to shed some light, to build some understanding, and provide clarity to the road ahead. As dispute resolvers, as students and scholars and practitioners, if you may, we know and we already embrace transformative power of mediation, right? We look at restorative justice as one of the paths. We look at negotiation, talking to each other, saying hello, greeting each other. We teach listening, we teach empathy, we talk about understanding, we talk about connecting with each other. But what's lacking is the question. How come our society is still lacking in connection, in understanding, and in justice? what we don't know, what is less clear, is how we in our field can contribute to the values of equality and justice. For example, can a neutral position, an impartial position, promote accountability? How does reconciliation square with systematic injustice? How do we address implicit bias in our field? Are there shortcuts that are being promoted that work on implicit bias? Is our role to facilitate a dialogue or action or both? And if so, how? I'm thrilled to be here with these esteemed panelists. They will share their life experience with you, their incredible work. And I encourage you all at all stages of learning, in all spheres of globe, to listen, to reach out, to connect, to collaborate. If we have learned something during this pandemic, my friends, it is that we are all in this struggle together and we're all connected, but we have power through collective action to illuminate the road ahead of us for the next generation of leaders and peacemakers. Allow me to first introduce my dean of our law school, Professor Paul Karen. In the brief introduction, he told me to keep it brief. He serves as the Duane and Kelly Roberts Dean of Pepperdine Caruso School of Law and has been on the Pepperdine faculty since 2013, serving as the Duane and Kelly Straus Distinguished Visiting Professor in the spring semesters from 2010 to 13. So thank you, Dean, for joining us through Straus Visiting Professorship. From 2015 to 17, he served as Associate Dean for Research and Development. And I can tell you, besides all the bio, and I'll read one more line from his sentence, he is an incredible person. He's been a personal mentor to me and to many in our law school. And he really cares for our field and cares for you. He has written over 50 books and law review articles, including most recently the Federal Wealth Transfer Taxation in 2015 by Foundation Press. Dean, we are so fortunate to have you here with us, and thank you for your support. Would you please give us some remarks?
Thank you, Suksamran. You're a dear friend and even more importantly, my neighbor who lives across the street from me now. Thank you so much. I am delighted to welcome all of you to today's fantastic and timely symposium hosted by our Straus Institute for Dispute Resolution, which is truly the crown jewel of our law school. In 1986, our law school saw the future of the ADR movement. We accepted the challenge to provide international leadership to this emerging field. We saw that the ability to resolve disputes in a collaborative, respectful, and thoughtful manner is absolutely essential in training lawyers and professionals to shape institutions that deliver justice and advance the rule of law throughout the world. Our institute's faculty and practitioners are pace setters in the ADR field, and they remain mindful of how they can use their leadership and training closer to home. Our students this year have served local communities in providing essential mediation services on COVID-19 related disputes. And our faculty have continued to lend their expertise to promote dialogue and understanding on issues of race, accountability, and justice. Indeed, Straus has deeply impacted the climate and culture of our law school, creating the space for our students, staff, and faculty to dialogue with each other, better understand one another, and come together. Over the past year, I have seen the power of dispute resolution help us reconcile as a community. And I truly believe that is the way forward for our country and for our world. It is so fitting that this event takes place this week after all that has transpired since the death of George Floyd and Tuesday's conviction of Derek Chauvin. There is so much work to be done in our society to understand and to uplift one another. I am grateful that Straus has convened us today to reflect, collaborate, and make progress to help the arc of the oral universe continue to bend towards justice. I want to thank our distinguished guests and our audience for joining us for this important symposium during this important week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Karen. Thank you for your uplifting words and inspiring words. Allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, my friends, a dear friend and a terrific human being, educator, professor, mentor, Professor Phyllis Bernard. Okay, you're up for a treat. Professor Bernard served as Distinguished Professor of Law at Oklahoma City University and School of Law. And she served as the founding director of the Law School Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution. Professor Bernard has done significant work in advancing ADR in Africa, including as a project director and principal grant author for Bayelsa Mediation Exchange, a US State Department grant to advance rule of law in strife-torn regions in Nigeria. Professor Bernard received the Southern California Mediation Association's Colin Millen Peacemaker Award for this work. She has also directed the Early Settlement Center Central Mediation Program for Oklahoma Supreme Court. She has authored thought-provoking work, and I'm a fan of hers. Please welcome Professor Phyllis Bernard. Professor, you may unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
There.
Thank you.
I am now unmuted. I don't want that to be lost, that it is an honor and it's a pleasure to be here today in this virtual symposium with the Straus Institute. And I'm going to do my best to try to stay on time, which may mean that some of the slides that are in this packet, you will end up taking home with you. I will touch on them, but I may not be able to spend the time going into them more deeply. That being said, welcome not only to the symposium, but welcome to the Inflection Point 2021. Next slide, please. For the past decade, the electric power industry, where I've served on the board of directors for a corporation that is, it's one of those that runs around with Cal ISO, only we have the middle portion of the United States. And the electric power industry has been at this inflection point that's described on this slide for at least 10 years or more, where the entire industry is changing. Here, it's a question of power that was based on a business model from the 19th century that needed to move forward into the 21st century with some fundamental changes if it's going to survive at all. Next slide, please. And when we apply that, scaling it up to the United States, and we look at legal education and we look at the field of dispute resolution, we are also at an inflection point. This particular graph shows on the left-hand side a high-level view of where we are as a nation. Now, of course, we have the stories that capture our attention in the media all the time. Underneath that curve are the driving forces behind what's going on that make this such an important point in history that, as I will be describing, is actually America's rendezvous with destiny. Number one, long before we had any concept of the pandemic coming, the expectation was that over this next decade, 40%, 40% of all of the jobs in the American workforce will be replaced by automation. And we repeat that, 40% of the jobs will be gone due to automation. Second driving force, as predicted since 1990 with the US Census that was taken then, the demographics of the United States are on a trajectory that are leading us by this next decade to be a majority minority country, no longer a majority white country. Now, for some people, that is the fulfillment of the American dream. For others, I think it's fair to say, as we heard in Charlottesville, it is an American nightmare. Third, the wealth gap. Oh, our poor United States middle class. It is shrinking and it is so burdened, especially the younger generation that's in school now, so burdened by student debt that we face a strain between the haves and the have-nots that is not paralleled by any other modern industrialized nation. In fact, if you go to the CIA's website, you'll see that in terms of income disparities, we rank along with third world countries. Now, on the right-hand side of this particular curve, you see that purple arrow that is showing what our potentialities are. We could curve up, we could curve down. And what's the difference? The difference is somewhere where I think that we as dispute resolution specialists can actually make a significant contribution. The insecurities around the economic and social changes are very real. Granted, some of it is objective fact, but much of it is the emotional response that people have to feeling as if we are being replaced, whether it's by machines, by somebody with a different color, or by people who are taking my money. And as we know, there are facts embedded in those feelings, facts in the feelings that are so strong that they can override almost anything else that we try to achieve. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go too deeply into this one, but I want you to remember these two books. Please order them as soon as you possibly can if you're interested in understanding these larger generational changes and generational theory. These two social scientists did a tremendous service to us all the way back in the 1990s. And everything that they had to say pretty much panned out, including pointing to 2020 as a pivotal time for the United States, the inflection point. And that was what I called, using my Wall Street lingo, a triple witching hour, when the cyclical crises of politics, economics, and society would all converge at the same time. How do we navigate this? Next slide, please. I think that the field of dispute resolution has a lot to bring to us in the times that Howe and Straus described as being a change of epochs. We're not just talking about another cycle. We are talking about the end of one epoch and the beginning of another. Well, when I listen to the news, I think as a former trainer for law enforcement, where we work with Oklahoma departments of police, sheriffs, and other law enforcement entities, including tribal police, I hear the calls for defunding the police as a call to institutionalize dispute resolution, which raises some significant questions. Who is going to institutionalize this? Who is going to be served? Who's going to be funding it? And I think the other question that many of us who have lived through the civil rights era and seen many transmutations of work that we started, how do we keep it from being co-opted? As a specialist in administrative law who has studied police excessive use of force for decades, when I hear the calls for accountability, I hear calls for adjudication by the courts, not arbitration, not mediation, but by the courts. Now, as a former management labor lawyer who collaborated with employee unions to attain mutual goals, and as a longtime corporate director, I hear the fear about unionization and the drive for unionization as a call for mediated communication in the workplace. As a former member of federal and state tribunals that adjudicated concerns that involved the public fisc and the public welfare, I hear the call for use of alternatives to adjudication with quite a bit of concern, frankly, that excessive use of ADR can actually undermine the rule of law. Next slide, please. And that rule of law is really important because law exists in order to rebalance power between the parties and to protect those larger public interests that simply are not necessarily represented by the parties to that specific case. Now, to achieve that, this is where legal education and the bars play a vital role to make sure that we have well-trained lawyers and that they are not so burdened, frankly, by their student debt that they cannot provide affordable legal services. A part of this for us as a legal profession also is to make sure that cultural awareness is not just an extra little CLE that's thrown into the schedule towards the end of the year, probably at 4 o'clock at the end of an 8-hour session, but rather that this is a central tenet of professional competence, not only for the lawyers, but also for court personnel. And I think it should be treated as an ethical obligation under the rules of professional conduct. There needs to be also some way to apprise the public, the legislators, the courts, everyone of what's going on in these cases that are decided, frankly, behind closed doors. Not to get rid of privacy and confidentiality, but to make sure that we don't see a gap starting to emerge between what the rule of law says and what people are actually doing. Next slide, please. So we have the big question: no justice, no peace. Can we do much to provide either one? Next slide, please. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, the dialogue about race and diversity nowadays looks a lot like this. And what can we as dispute resolution professionals do? And what makes this time different than it was, for example, in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement? Next slide, please. For one, there's a massive call for divesting or defunding the police. Now, does that mean increasing community mediation? Next slide, please. I would say that the inflection point is engagement by whites across class, age, and geographic lines. America hasn't seen this before in such widespread numbers when it comes to racial justice in modern times, especially in this century, in every part of the nation, even in little bitty towns where there may be no Black folk or a few Black folk. Still, there were BLM protests, including way out here on the Olympic Peninsula. Go back and read that yellow box there. Edward Baptiste does some amazing work on slavery and capitalism, and now he's focusing on policing. This is a white guy, by the way, okay, from North Carolina. Next slide, please. Just a visual to remind us the way that I might have cheered when I saw Black Lives Matter being painted on the street outside the White House was not necessarily the way it appeared to other people. Next slide, please. And as some of us who are a bit older and in positions of some bureaucratic authority in some institutions are kind of saying, as the youngsters come pushing for more and more and more, just a reminder, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, that being said, recognize I am not one to push for trying to negotiate directly with people like you see in these photographs. I don't want anybody to get shot, honestly. That's not a joke. However, the work that I have done overseas and the work that I have done trying to look at my own home state of Oklahoma and the lynchings and the riots and trying to deal with the dynamics of crowds and political violence, I think there is something that we can do as mediators and facilitators and negotiators. And that is to support change through deep listening skills applied to the people who are on the sidelines and silent, okay, who have not yet reached that tipping point. A focus on outward observable behaviors that can be measured. I frankly don't believe in trying to transform somebody's heart and mind. I'm looking at observable behaviors, not ineffable attitudes and beliefs. Next slide, please. And we added here a little note from my father, who grew up in rural Louisiana during the Depression and was drafted into the U.S. Army after he got his medical degree and finished his training in surgery. And this was during the desegregation of the Army. This Black man from Louisiana was assigned to an all-white MASH unit in Fort Hood, Texas, and then in Germany. The point here I would like to make in particular is it doesn't matter that much what's going on in somebody's heart or mind. What matters is their outward behavior, and that can become a product of the subculture of the organization, the institution, the community. In the 1950s and going forward, it was the US military demand for good order and military discipline. Next slide, please. I want you to take a look at this one more to understand that we have unions and big business now engaged in this struggle about justice and voting rights. Recognize the reason why is that they have pressure points that are global, their markets are global, and their employee base is highly diverse. This is another inflection point. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that I hope you'll hold on to, no matter if you forget everything else. This one was given to me by my favorite history professor and mentor back when I was in college. And it was his explanation of why the United States is not able to see large, continued movements for social change. And that's because if you organize according to one line, say race, and you follow that through very quickly, it's bisected by gender. You try to organize according to class, you move down and very quickly, it's bisected by race. And you can follow that way almost anywhere you go on this particular chart, and that's going to basically be the same response. Next slide, please. Just an example of how this works. I'm going to start on the far end here because so often people forget about geography. Vast differences between how people expect the world to operate and communications to be, depending upon where you are geographically. If you have any questions about that, take a look at my cousin Vinny, one of the best teaching tools I've ever had on this subject. Look at age. When it comes to gender issues, the perceptions and values around gender identities, plural, can differ widely depending upon age. And when it comes to race, religion oftentimes has more to do with how people will align their values than the color of their skin. Next slide, please. Now I want to focus in a little bit more on the generational differences. This is a different generation of African-American youth. And I have wondered sometimes, especially when I saw that t-shirt that's on the right-hand side there, we are not our ancestors. We will mess you up. I thought, ooh, my. And I watched these young people out there in the street. I watched their courage. I watched their discipline. I watched their determination and I said, oh, these are my babies. These are ours. And I realized they kind of skipped their parents' generation. That the people who are out in the street now and are making these demands are much more attuned to my heroine, Angela Davis, back in 1972, maybe even more so than Angela Davis in like 2019, which is the picture at the bottom. Next slide, please. But one of the things that Straus and Howe do, especially in the fourth turning, is to talk about the role of the different generations. Our baby boomer role is to be support for the young warriors who are out on the front line. But I did just want to add this one thing. I wonder whether the desire for this generation of African-American youth to distinguish themselves from prior generations, does that derive perhaps from the narrow perspective of the civil rights era through history that was co-opted, frankly, in order to create a national Martin Luther King Day? What they did with the Martin Luther King Day was to diminish Martin's actual message about economic justice, American hegemony, and what it really means for this country to fulfill its duties. His message actually was no less radical than Malcolm's. They just did it in a different style. And actually, they were pretty good friends. Next slide, please. We ask here what will be lost and what will remain during this time of great change. One of the things I've learned on the Olympic Peninsula is that even giants can fall. If you can find me there in the left-hand picture, that's me with a Douglas fir in the Hoh Rainforest, which is just less than an hour from where I live. And on the right-hand side is me, that little green dot down at the bottom of the roots of one of those trees that was knocked over in a major storm and washed up on a beach. Next slide. I hope that won't become our American legal system. That's going to be up to us. If the roots remain strong, a tree can eventually flourish again. And this slide here is an homage to all of our grandparents and great-grandparents who survived the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. It was a shock to me to realize that the fabulous days of my grandmother's youth, where she felt so alive and engaged, was when she was a visiting nurse in Harlem during the 1918-1919 pandemic, and they had nothing to be able to cure people. We're in a much better spot right now. Next slide, please. Because we know now that we are the ones we have been waiting for. This is our time. And it's so wonderful to know that you're all there and engaged. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this morning with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernard. The depth of your understanding triggers a very quick thought. And once an ambassador told me, sometimes we have to make the problems bigger, broader, complex, not simpler to understand them. I think today you showed us that there is no one simple solution here. We have to understand. We also have to empathize and thank the people who are joining us in this movement. I really thank you for your kind words and for your wisdom, for your time with us today. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Ms. Aparna Gupta, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Bernard. This was just an incredible way to start and frame our conversation over the next couple of panels. I heard you say, I heard a call in your remarks, a call for cultural competency, a call for courage, and a call for deep listening, and as the predecessor to deep understanding. And the way we were thinking about our next panel is, how do we get our students and our young mediators, right, to engage in this work? And how do we also bring along some of the more experienced voices like you, voices in many of the panelists that are joining us today? So the panel we have assembled is incredible scholars, but they're incredible leaders too. Leaders not just in the academy, but leaders in action. And truly, in my work with students, I see that they look to their professors for direction in such deep ways, especially during the pandemic, especially during the unrest that we've seen. And professors who lead by example, who show that it is okay to be vulnerable, it is okay to process things alongside your student. And it's okay to make mistakes and learn. And so I'm so pleased that we have 3 amazing lights that are going to be joining us for this next panel, which will be about 75 minutes or so. And after that, we'll have a short break. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Singh now, who's going to lead us into it and moderate the next one. Thank you, Professor Bernard.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Professor Bernard. Thank you again. Aparna, you may want to pin people. What I like to do, folks, is I will introduce each panelist at slightly different time, so we remember who the panelists are instead of doing an introduction to all of them. So I want to start this very exciting panel that I'm really motivated to contribute towards moderation. I want to call I'm moderating it, is starting with Dr. Jacqueline Von Guzman. Dr. Von Guzman serves as the inaugural Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Eastern Mennonite University, where she provides guidance to the university community and advances DEI initiatives and goals for the institution. She also serves on the Campus Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, serves on the President's Cabinet and Provost Council, and builds supportive relationships with the university. Until recently, Dr. Von Guzman was a professor of law and studies, conflict studies, and director in the negotiation and conflict resolution program at Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. She conducted qualitative research with a focus on the fields of healthcare disputes, disparities, law, citizenship, and conflict engagement. But listen to this. One thing that I am so happy and engaged with and enjoy reading about her work and admire her work so much is Dr. Guzman explores how marginalized individuals create alternate stories and counter narratives to address institutional, structural injustices. So I will actually, if you all permit me, start with my first question to our Dr. Von Guzman, and then go to our next speaker, introduce the speaker, and ask the next question. So let me ask you this question, Doctor. What structural systematic changes need to happen in our academic institutions, if you may, to have diverse and inclusive classrooms in which every student feels like they belong? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation first and your humbling introduction. This is a topic that I'm actually extremely passionate about. And I think, first of all, it takes a lot of courage to have these conversations, and it takes a lot of courage to come to them with the intentionality of making real change. And no surprise, context and naming matters. And I think I'm speaking to the choir here for the most part. But Sadie Smith, an English novelist, said, "You cannot fight for a freedom you have failed to identify." And I think one thing to have in mind is that for those of us who have been minoritized for any particular reason, or because of our gender, or our national identity, or our race, or any other way or shape of minoritizing or marginalization, that it does feel like it's oppressive. So we are really fighting for freedom more than also change. And the first thing that I always like to focus in is working with how our academic institutions historically, really, they don't need to be fixed as much as they need to be transformed or dismantled and built again. Because in many ways, they are exactly working like they were designed to work. They historically, very elitist. If you have the money, you go. If you have more money, you go to a better school. If you have less money, you go to a less better school. Or in terms of resources, what universities get the resources, which ones don't. And so it's a very challenging and daunting task. And when I do this work, one of the first things that I think we need to focus in is that we assume that we all have the same vocabulary, and that we all know what white supremacist means, or what diversity means, or belonging means. And in a way, before jumping into just starting to make the changes, I always like to make sure that at the institutional level, we are sharing the same language. And the reason this is important is, I think, for many reasons, but one of them is I have felt being in those situations where, again, I'm not the mainstream person, or I'm not the person in the majority, that when you don't have the language, you start in a way blaming yourself. Well, maybe there is something wrong with me. And so think of our students, that they are in disempowered situations. They're not in a powerful position, that you don't want students to be feeling like, is there something wrong with me? And so having that common language is really important. And the other big thing is having conversations about safety and belonging are two different things. That we jump, again, very quickly trying to fix things. And we sometimes forget that not only are we all exhausted and tired, and like Professor Singh said at the beginning, that yes, we're all on this together, but we are not really being impacted in the same way. And so when we're talking about safety and belonging, you can't really belong until you feel safe enough to even be able to have a voice. And talking with students, I mean, it's sometimes surprising how we do think that some group of students actually feel like they belong, and they don't really feel like they belong. And part of it is they don't even feel safe to be able to raise the issue. So I think we need to really start seeing that conversation about safety is an issue, and it's a real issue. Equity, belonging, and inclusion, finally, really does require building relationships. We cannot really move forward together unless we get, in many ways, we get out of our head and start thinking emotionally as well. And so our intellectual exercises of trying to figure out how all these things play out is an important one, but we need to take it one step beyond and really start connecting with each other across differences, creating the spaces on our campuses so that these conversations can happen. And then we can go more directly to the specific things, right? External forces like ABA accreditations, so much work to be done there. It is like Professor Bernard just said, are we going to include things like cultural competency? Our curriculums, are we going to start shifting our curriculums and looking at what students really need to be in a minority majority now, where we're going to have by 2040 a population that is not going to be mainly white? How are we doing our hiring processes? Where are we looking for faculty? How are we onboarding them? How are we making sure that they feel welcome in the community so that they can stay? And the last thing I'm going to touch upon is, how do we build institutional capacity to address issues that create hostile environments but do not meet the threshold that laws like Title IX require? And I think this is a big one. We tend to channel as lawyers. We love, the processes and the rules and the laws, and we forget that there's going to be a significant amount of situations that they're not going to meet that threshold, but they're still not okay, because they're not allowing us to share our common humanity. And so we need to start building those parallel processes, not in substitution of, but to have people be able to have those places where they may not even have a legal action, and yet they're not feeling welcome or belonging, or they're feeling discriminated. So I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss further later.
Thank you so much. Professor Von Guzman, I would love to hear comments of our panelists. Instead of me repeating back, I'll just say one quick word, and that is, love your comments on working for change. How do we have to include faculty among different constituencies, and the importance of belonging, and how safety and belonging are different conversations that we cannot club together at times. I just hope we pause for a second to understand the depth of those comments. I'm delighted, folks, to invite now Professor Sharon Press to the conversation. Professor Press, as I'm sure most of you know, is director of the Dispute Resolution Institute, DRI, at Michelle Hamlin School of Law, and she joined there in 2009. And she teaches a variety of subjects: mediation, negotiation, mediation clinic, in both online and in-person formats. But in addition, she directs the Israel Study Abroad program, conflict resolution from religious traditions. She currently serves as co-president of community mediation Minnesota, and is board member of the Community Mediation and Restorative Services, and the Institute for Study for Conflict Transformation. Now, besides the fact that she mediates, she belongs to different boards on the council, and I just want to say that she is someone I highly admire, not the fact that I worked with her when I was at Hamline University. Her smile it travels far, and her energy is infectious. She truly, like Professor Guzman, she truly believes in this. And I'm just so thankful for your contributions to our field. I know you have won numerous awards, and I'll just include one for the sake of brevity, and that is Mary Parker Foley Award for Excellence in Innovation in Dispute Resolution by the Association of Conflict Resolution. So Professor Press, with that little introduction, would you please comment and say hello and greetings and comment on what you heard, and what are you doing, if you don't mind, your program is doing at Hamline, at Mitchell Hamline, about such discussions, inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. And Simran, it's always just a pleasure to be with you. And of course, because you started in your home is always with us. So we know, and we are with great pride, we watch how you have advanced in your career and the tremendous work you're doing at Pepperdine. And Aparna, I want to also thank you for the kind invitation to participate in this program. And I will say that, it was, it's very humbling to be a part of this particular panel, both because of the great respect that I have for the other members of the panel, and you'll soon introduce Homer LaRue, in addition to Jackie Von Guzman, who you all met previously. But even to be talking about this subject as a white woman coming to this work, and really recognizing the importance of that humility. And Jackie talked a little bit about that of course, the brilliant beginning that we had with Professor Bernard of, how of recognizing as professors, instructors, teachers, we don't have all of the answers, that we are in partnership. And, I think that all of us were really moved this summer. And of course, I teach in Minnesota, which was the epicenter of everything that was happening. And it made me take that step back as an instructor, and to look really carefully at where were their embedded whiteness that had crept into the textbooks that I use, the exercises that we use, the discussions, how things were framed in all of that. And I want to also give a shout out to my colleague Ellen Deason, who I saw as I was scrolling around. We have an article that's coming out in the Cardozo Law Journal about really looking at the embedded whiteness in mediation and raising questions and recognizing we don't have all of the answers, but doing a fair amount in the classroom to put it out there and say, what are those things that don't sit exactly right with that? And so we've always, as Simran knows, at DRI intentionally embedded our courses and our course offerings with looking at all of these different aspects, but that's not enough. And I think we all need to go deeper in that. And I'll just recount two examples that I think are important and illustrate the challenges we have. Until there is increased diversity in our law schools, we have the experience that Jackie so eloquently pointed out of people feeling other and being, sort of one of only one or a couple of people who have then feel the burden of speaking from their experience. And I, contrast that with work that I've done at the Central European University and teaching there, where everybody is, comes from all these diversity. And so you don't have to introduce diversity as a topic to discuss. It's present, it's there in the room, and people can very naturally explore that. We are faced with a much more challenging experience. And I'll just share one last comment, because I know I don't want to take up too much time, and say I was teaching this Tuesday from 2 to 4 p.m. in Minnesota Central Time, when we got news at 3 o'clock that the verdict was in and would come out within the next hour. And needless to say, I was incapable of focusing on teaching, nor was anybody in the class really able to focus on it. So we switched and we had a general conversation. But there was only, it was my clinic class, so there was only one African-American woman in the class. And I followed up with her after, because it really concerned me as to how did that conversation land for her. And we had a wonderful conversation about that after the fact. And I was so humbled and appreciative that she felt that she would have that conversation with me, because I also recognize that those of us who are white need to do our education ourselves. That we can't put this burden on our friends, our colleagues, our students to teach and educate us, that we have the work that we have to do. And so perhaps I should leave it there.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Professor Press. I just quickly, in less than 10 seconds, if I may, I love your point of recognizing that we have to understand who we are, what we bring to the table as professors, our skin color, our background, and teaching students through that self-reflection through a model instead of just preaching, and that you brought to our awareness. I believe in that, Professor, and I thank you for speaking for your work and introducing us to your thinking. And I love the part of we are in partnership. We need increased diversity, period. And not because diversity is the only solution. That's because diverse voices do add diverse pictures that may add stories that may add to the minds of our students and make them more beautiful, if you may, in their thinking from diverse perspectives. We'll come back to you, Professor. Give us a minute. Well, maybe more than a minute. I want to go to Professor Homer LaRue. Let me just say a few words about him as well. He first of all, he is the recipient of a recent 2020 D. Allenbert Raven Award. And if you not know about that award, it is from the ABS section for dispute resolution, and is the highest award given by the section for outstanding service to the ADR community. So you can see how blessed we have to have all 3 stars today with us. Mr. LaRue teaches lawyering skills, civil procedure, professional responsibility, and founding faculty of the City University of New York School of Law, has experience in development of a national recognized first-year clinical experience at the University of Maryland. He also served as a director of clinical education at the District of Columbia School of Law. Lastly, I want to say he's also, like our other professors, colleagues, and he's accomplished as a mediator, as an arbitrator. And he has developed programs to assist persons of colors in becoming mediators and arbitrators in labor and non-labor disputes, which I highly, highly admire.
Hi there, thank you. Good to see you.
We need more mentors. We'll try to mute this, our friends. So we need that, sir. I appreciate that you encouraging, like other colleagues, to bring people in. I do want to say, let me ask you this question, and you have your foot in both academics and practice. May I ask you a little bit about your contribution? Now, Harvard Law School has a long and storied history of promoting social justice. Is there a particular role for Harvard and perhaps other HBCUs in furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ADR community? And any other comments you have from previous panelists, please.
Thank you, Professor. It's a delight to be here, an honor to be with an old friend and colleague, Sharon Press, and a new friend and colleague, Professor Von Guzman. And it is also very good to see Professor Bernard once again. It's been a long time. She and I have been colleagues and friends for some time. I'll try to be brief, but I want to start my remarks from something that has been said about safety and belonging. And let me start with some statistics about Howard Law School. This year, we have had a report from the Dean's office, the Dean of Admissions office. And ordinarily at this point in time, our application pool would be somewhere around 1,500 persons for 150 seats. Our application pool this year is somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 for that same number of seats. Now ponder that for a moment. That's a threefold increase. And this is the first year that that's happened. And I think that it's happened in part because of something that Professor Von Guzman said. Howard and other HBCUs, for Black students anyway, is first seen as a place of safety. And then they can develop belonging. And I think that's a significant point to be made here. Obviously, there's also a role for us then once we have these persons in the school. What Professor Bernard pointed out was the necessity for having well-trained lawyers. So what I think that is important, and I run an ADR program at the law school, and the question I've been asked a number of times is, why is it important to teach ADR? There are so many other social justice movements and other ways that Howard has been at the forefront in changing the law. Why ADR, which seems to be opposite law? Well, my one answer in terms of the vein of training lawyers is that a lawyer of the 21st century who does not have two, not one, but two tool bags is an ill-trained lawyer. One of those tool bags, we all know, it's the skills of being an adjudicator, either in a courtroom or an administrative proceeding. And we are all quite good at that. But we also know that increasingly our clients, be they individuals, corporations, unions, organizations, find themselves in an alternative forum for the resolution of their disputes. And a lawyer who is not trained in those skills and thinks that somehow they can take their adjudication skills into those forums does ill service to the system and to their clients. So my philosophy in teaching my students and the students at Howard why ADR is not because they're going to become mediators upon graduation. In fact, I think I would be leading them on a false path, because we all know it's not easy to do that. But as advocates, they are going to need the skills that we do teach in order to become a mediator. And so putting them in that role now as they're in law school gives them an understanding, an inside understanding of how to manipulate that process. And I don't mean manipulate in the pejorative. I mean manipulate in the sense of a surgeon manipulating a scalpel with skill, with mastery, with an understanding of what is to be accomplished. And so those are the kinds of things I think that we are trying, at least I'm trying to develop at Howard. And obviously, we don't have all the same resources, but I think that it's important nonetheless for me to continue to develop that kind of lawyer that comes out of Howard University School of Law. And I would hope that we would somehow be able to expand that to other HBCUs as well. The part that I will not go into great detail, but is in answer to your question, Professor, in terms of contribution, I think gaining access for Black students, for other students who are underrepresented in various areas is extremely important. So I'm very proud of one program that I started 6 years ago, going into the 7th year, in which I placed third-year students in the internal justice system of the World Bank. A very important institution in terms of development, but as most of you will know, the World Bank employees are not entitled to have their workplace disputes resolved in the courts of the United States or in any administrative agencies because they have privileges and immunities. Therefore, they've had to develop an internal justice system. So our students have an opportunity to work for a year in that system with the myriad of cultures, languages that exist there. And the interesting thing about it is that the difficulty that we had initially was some pushback in which the bank said, well, we already have lots of Americans in the bank. But when we drilled down a little bit further, what did we find? There are almost no Black African Americans in management positions in the bank. And so this program begins to create a pipeline. And I think that other institutions ought to be looking at ways of addressing what I call the front end of the ADR problem, getting more people of color, more people from underrepresented groups onto the path of becoming mediators and being able to work in this area. So I'll stop here and perhaps we can get to some of the questions from the audience.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Two comments quickly, and I also want to first seek any feedback from our other panelists. If you have any comments, you have follow-ups to what you heard, I would love to hear from you. My quick follow-up is this. You mentioned place of safety, Professor, and then belonging, as Professor Bernard spoke about earlier, gaining access to all students. And then you mentioned professional identity, how we need to work with shaping, reshaping, including diversity in professional identity. Two comments there. Number one, I'm very pleased that you worked with World Bank. At Pepperdine, we're working closely with our friends at JAMS, and who are very caring and conscious of what we need to do, and I really applaud their leadership. I see two of them today. In fact, here, I see David Brandon, who is the managing director for the JAMS Foundation here, listening, and a good friend of ours. And I also see the CEO of JAMS, Mr. Chris Poole here. And I appreciate your participation, your time to listen to this deep conversation, a conversation that definitely needs to happen at national and perhaps international stage. My second comment is this, Professor. I hope today's conversation serves as a hope to some students who are from around the world. I've seen students from India, Brazil, in our guests today. Because if you see, America has a lot of issues. I want to just give a unique perspective and go to my other panelists very quickly. There's one beauty in America, that a person like me, who is an immigrant who came from India, can become the director of one of the really good programs. And I salute that inclusion of America too, of white and other, including brown and Black people. We should have both conversations at the same time. So I want to just tell you how many countries it will not be possible for a person like me to become director of a program, period. I won't name those cultures now right away, but you are smart to figure this out. I want to go back to Professor Sharon Press, if you have any comments you would like to make, and then I also want to hear from Dr. Jackie Von Guzman, and then we'll go to next questions. And also very soon, folks, we'll open up to Q&A with the panelists. Give me about another 10 to 15 minutes and we'll open up for any questions you may have. You have a choice to write those questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, we'll have you ask those questions. Professor Press?
Yeah, so, when I am in the presence of such wonderful colleagues, I find that it is most important to listen and do less speaking around this. But, there's no question that I was privileged a couple of years ago when the Dispute Resolution Section Conference was in DC to get to visit Homer at Howard and to hear more directly about this wonderful program at the World Bank. And I think it's, has really been a pioneer in so many ways of speaking about and doing and putting in place activities and programs to make a difference. And, as I reflect back, because as Homer said, we go back a long way, that, Homer was talking about and doing things well before anybody else was really thinking about it. And I'm really grateful for what I have learned from him over this period of time, and the steady leadership which he has shown, which, as I reflect on it, I know how exhausting that must be, and I'm grateful that you did not get so exhausted to stop, that you have continued on. And Jackie, it gives me great hope for all of the things that you have done and that you continue to do now in this new position, in this new platform that you have to really affect change in a whole new aspect of life. And of course, Sukhsimran, the work that you have been doing over your professional career to really increase people's awareness and to raise that up. It's so valuable. So again, I speak from a place of great humility to be in with all of you.
Professor Press, looks like you're trained in something like conflict management or mediation skills. You're such a good speaker. Is that something to do with? Thank you so much, Professor, for those wonderful remarks. I want to also give a chance to Professor Jackie Von Guzman, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel just, again, so humbled also to be able to have this discussion with such distinguished panelists, and certainly with the invitation from Straus Institute, which has been a leader within ADR and the formation of professionals of the law to actually learn more beyond the law, but also how to engage with their clients and people and change the world. So it is very humbling. And I want to just touch very quickly on one thing, Sharon, and another one that Homer, you touched on, which I think is so important. And you mentioned, Sharon, about the importance of just owning your own knowledge, right? Like going out and learning and not putting it on others, or just to take that ownership and that agency. And I think that is so important. And I think the other thing that goes with that is that sometimes we just try to understand too much. Not the understanding that you are talking about, which is the knowledge and the who we are and what baggage we bring, but we try to really truly understand the other. And I think we, in many ways, need to get past that to be able to form a community, because things like, let's put ourselves in someone else's shoes, or let's try to, which is getting at the empathy and understanding, they will never fit. Some of us may feel at times like we don't even have shoes and we're walking through this pebble, this just path full of pebbles. And so it reminded me of there's a Edward Glissant is a philosopher from Martinique and a poet. He's from the Caribbean and I'm from the Caribbean, so I do a lot of research in that area. And he talks about the right to opacity, and what he means with that is just the right to not being understood. That we can still continue to engage with each other, that we can still continue to form community and build community, and then we don't have to perfectly understand each other. And so I think that those are things that within the ADR field, teaching our students and the legal profession that it's okay to have that uncertainty, And that doesn't mean that still we can focus on behaviors, like Dr. Bernard was saying, that could make us better beings, better humans, and better lawyers at the end of the day. And so I think that was extremely powerful. And Homer, I really, Professor LaRue, I really enjoyed also your the importance of teaching lawyers to just engage with each other. And I think the power of story there is really important. I think we focus a lot on facts, and we sometimes forget that how the facts will tell us the what, then where, the what happened. You know, the stories go deeper. The stories tell us our needs, the impact of a particular action on our lives, on our daily lives. And I see the legal profession starting to do a shift that I think is very positive. I think this is for sure. And how is it that that inflection point, right, where we are actually just getting there? And my hope is that we just get on that wagon and really, really continue to work hard, because I think from my perspective, there is really no more. One of the most powerful subversive acts is actually the power of community and relationships and coming together. And so that's what I'm hoping we do, not only within our own schools or wherever we are, but actually as a field of ADR, that we're starting to come together in different ways. And I think that's significant, and it's very powerful. And it's a real honor and blessing to be a part of that with such amazing colleagues.
Professor LaRue, do you have any quick comments back?
Only to footnote what both of my colleagues have said. I don't want to say very much because they've said it so well. I simply endorse what both of you have said. Thank you.
I will go to Professor Press next to ask your question. We all understand, or try to understand, our field of dispute resolution. May I ask you this question? How do you see the role of ADR, alternative appropriate dispute resolution, in social justice, and social justice in appropriate dispute resolution?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question right now, and one that, those of us who have been in this field, if we're not asking that question now, I wonder, what are you doing? Because, it is this, as Professor Bernard spoke about, we're at this really fascinating inflection point, and we ought to be asking ourselves, in this field of dispute resolution, and specifically, the area that I have worked most closely in is mediation. And so I tend to sort of go there. If we're not asking ourselves the question, is it actually promoting social justice and social appropriateness, justice in the way that it was intended? We really need to rethink things. And so I very much believe that there is a place for social justice in alternative dispute resolution. I think from a simplistic way, I will say that I absolutely would include the concepts of restorative justice under the broad umbrella. And so that, of course, in and of itself, belongs. But beyond that, we've been doing some thinking about this very question at the Dispute Resolution Institute, because, as I said, this has been a time of great reflection for us. And one of the things that has come to our mind is that an expertise that our institute and our field carries is the ability to bring people together, to convene. And so what I have identified, and we have identified at the Dispute Resolution Institute, is a pretty major project called Truth and Action, focused on the criminal justice system and addressing the disparities. And the expertise we are bringing to the table is not expertise in the criminal justice system. I don't have those expertise, but what I do have the ability to do is to work with people and to bring people together who have those expertise and maybe haven't sat together in the same room. And so we've created an advisory committee that is very broad brush across community leaders and the county attorneys and people in law enforcement and people who have sort of the range of experience. And the idea is to collect, not only to look at the data that we know already exists that exemplifies where all those disparities are in the criminal justice system, starting in law enforcement, but certainly not ending there. You know, going through prosecutorial discretion and court hearings and corrections and reentry and all of those places where we have embedded racism into the process, looking at that and combining it with people's lived experiences. Because there was no question in my mind that the world related to George Floyd because he was not a paper person. He was a three-dimensional human being, and we connected with his story. And so we need to be able to connect those real stories with those disparities, because let's face it, if data alone would drive change, it would have happened long ago. The data has been there. We need to do something different. So I believe that our role as practitioners is both in looking up very much at our systems and what we're doing and ensuring that we are not doing harm and that we are promoting justice, and also thinking about the skills we bring that can convene and that can bring people together.
May I add
Please.
something to what Sharon has said? I completely agree and think that the role for us, that is those of us in the ADR community, is equally applicable to the action part of that title. We can no longer, because I know that Jackie said it, I've said it, that part exhausts us. We are tired of simply talking about and getting to no action. But I think that doesn't mean we throw out the convening role, which I believe is true, is our expertise. So when I work with people like Terry Amsler, having difficult conversations, not for the sake of the conversation, but for the sake of developing a plan of action. So, bravo.
Homer for picking up on that it was the exact intention that this is not, it was purposely not a truth and reconciliation, because it's enough about talking. It's enough. It's time for action. And so it was very, very intentional that this was a truth and action project, because we don't want to stop until there is change, until there is action.
Can I just jump in quickly? Because I think this is just so wonderful and exciting. And because just to pick it, even what both of you have just said, which I think is so important, is the question that just came in my mind is, do we want to use ADR and the skills and the power of convening to teach people how to navigate oppression and injustices within systems, or do we want them to actually not only understand how they operate, but how to then change them, which I think is where the action comes, right? So for me, this is just such a crucial point and importance, because we don't dismiss the power of conversations and dialogues, but we take it to the next level. And I feel, as a Latinx woman that has moved to the US to do this work, that many times it's like, oh my God, they're just teaching me how to navigate this. And it's helpful. I mean, don't get me wrong. I want to learn how to navigate it also. And I want our students to know how to navigate it, but it's just not enough. And so that's why I think this is so crucial.
Thank you. My next question is to Mr. Homer LaRue. And the question is, speaking of action, you have written about increasing the selection of diverse neutrals as arbitrators and mediators throughout the Ray Corollary Initiative, RCI. Could you tell us more about the RCI as a means of increasing diversity and inclusion in arbitration and mediation, and what impact, if any, the use of the 30% metric has had on the selection process? Thank you.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. I've written about this in a law review article and in an article that came out in the ABA magazine, which I would recommend to you for the details. Let me first start with what does the Ray Corollary Initiative stand for? Charlotte Ray was the first African-American woman to graduate from law school and to be admitted to a bar in the United States. Therefore, I thought it appropriate to name this initiative after her, thus Ray Corollary Initiative. The RCI is based upon two other initiatives that preceded it, the Rooney Rule and the Mansfield Rule. The Rooney Rule, for those of you who follow football, know that it was designed to increase Black head coaches of teams. And it has had some success, and it's also duly criticized. The Mansfield Rule has been applicable to big law. It has as its goal the increase of underrepresented persons in law firms, not only as partners, but as parts of pitch teams, which are very important, and other high-level lateral moves. It's managed by an organization called the Diversity Lab. And firms now seek to be Mansfield Rule certified. It has become a badge of honor and one that they use for business, for promoting their business. RCI, the reason I called it a corollary is we didn't need another rule. A corollary is a subset of a rule. And so my idea here is to apply those principles that have been used successfully in the ADR field. And I trust in this group, I don't have to identify that we have a problem, and we have a problem that we should be ashamed of after 30 years. The number of persons who are selected as arbitrators and mediators, particularly in high-level disputes, is alarmingly white, old, and male. And that's just the reality. So the Ray Corollary is based on a notion that the 30% metric, which comes from empirical studies, shows that if the final slate for selection includes 30% of the underrepresented population that you want to have represented, then the probability of a person of color or a woman or some person from another underrepresented group being selected goes up exponentially if you maintain that 30%. Now, I've been criticized that 30% isn't enough, but the empirical data seems to say that it does make a significant difference. What has been the success? There is one, I'm not going to name the company, but there is one company that is nationwide that notified me just 2 weeks ago that in their upcoming negotiations with all of their unions, they have put on the table a proposal that all future arbitration slates be 30% underrepresented persons. And they intend to negotiate that with the unions on nationwide. And so we are also developing a pledge that we are taking to all sorts of organizations, including the ABA, various ABA sections, corporate counsel, plaintiffs bar, but we'll be doing that, rolling that out very soon. The National Academy of Arbitrators has been was the first to endorse the program. The ABA section of dispute resolution has endorsed the RCI as well, and both of them have been key in moving that forward.
I salute you for that work and for your continuous struggle. This is exactly the action that we were discussing a few minutes earlier that you've already taken. So and you're taking. I also want to remind everybody that Singapore Convention, which is signed and ratified by enough countries to be in force, is what struggling. I have spoken at the convention. We were invited, and Professor Thomas Stepanovic and myself from Straus, we were there. And one of the points I raised at the convention was, how do we make sure that mediation, and especially, as Mr. LaRue mentioned, international commercial cases of these large mediation cases do not fall into the trap that arbitration already has, as he rightly put, as to the lack, the dearth, the extreme lack and dearth of diversity, both in terms of gender, race, and allow me to add, and culture. And what can we do about it? So I thank you. I applaud your work, and you giving us example on how to lead in this. Allow me, folks, to tell you where we are. We've got about 17 minutes left for this panel. I see Nidhi Maheshwari, I see your hand up. I would invite anybody else to raise your electronic hand, which is in Zoom. Don't try to, if you can't, just wave at us, we'll find it. And one of our colleagues will. So please have 2 or 3 questions ready. My last question before we wrap up formal questions is to Professor Jackie again, which is summarizing our panel, which thank you all 3 of you. You're wonderful. Thank you for all the work you do. What values, Professor, and principles and beliefs and practices do you think we need to reconsider in the field of ADR to address structural racism in a meaningful way, if you may, please?
Yes, I'll be very brief because I do want to have give time to the audience to ask any questions. So very briefly, I just really do think that we should be reconsidering every single one of our beliefs and values and models. It's the time to come and look at them. It's that inflection point that was so eloquently explained by Professor Bernard in her keynote. We need to start shifting and thinking about creating new paradigms, new ways of thinking. And doing that together, I think, as opposed to getting into just a few of us and getting in a group and doing it, trying to be as expansive as we can. That would be my dream, so that our students benefit from it, our communities benefit from it, and our institutions benefit from it. So I think we need to take a really deep dive and look at every single value, belief, model that we have out there, and look at it in the light of the 21st century and a shifting population that will not be looking the same I believe by 2040. And so that would be my short answer to your very complex and amazing question.
I want to go to our allow me to, I want to say a lot of things, but I'm gonna, we learn as mediators to learn to stop ourselves. So I think I learned hopefully a little bit of that. Let's go to, I think, Ms. Maheshwari, you were the first one to raise your hand. Why don't you please unmute yourself and quickly ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. And first of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am Nidhi Maheshwari. I'm attending this meeting from India. So good evening, everyone. It's evening here. So first of all, this meeting is extremely astounding with eminent panelists on the board. I would like to ask Professor Jackie, ma'am, you spoke about belongingness and how students of different culture and nationality face the problem of belongingness these days. So what is your take on how to increase this belongingness into their heart, and what role does ADR plays in it? Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I think that ADR plays an essential, crucial part of it. If you think about it, belonging is really feeling that you can have a voice and talk. That is the foundation of democracy, right? That we all have each a voice and that we all are able to participate fully into our democratic processes. And if we are not fully if we don't fully belong, we are not we're not citizens. We are not full citizens of whether it be a nation, a community, an international community. And so ADR plays a crucial role precisely because I think it creates the possibility of raising stories that are not confined by rules of evidence, that are not confined by processes and regulations that we have in our traditional legal system, which are there in place for a reason. And in that context, they are necessary, right? Because it helps us get through a legal process. But like I had said before, many of the issues that we're confronted around lack of belongingness or safety are not the safety of someone's going to kill me, right? Necessarily, or someone, I'm thinking in the institutions, we tend to associate safety with the physical harm. And so the problem with the legal option, traditional option, is that it is harder to prove those type of events. Like, how do I prove I don't belong? In great part because belongingness takes place to an operation where it's not so much by what it's said, but by what is left out. So speaking from experience many times, sense of belongingness does not necessarily come because someone told me something. That's easier, right? I can respond, I can call out, or I can call in, I can try to figure out what's going on. But many times in our institutions and in our academic institutions and within the legal system as well, it happens by omission. And so you're left with, how can I even address something that is not being said? And if you do, you come across as being petty, right? And I'll give you a very concrete example. Academia in law schools that I've been, and many of my colleagues, by talking to them, always highlight in the white male articles, the publications, the presentations, you know, the white male goes out and presents anything, even if only 10 people showed up, and it makes every single newsletter and every single website, you know, and then you have this other minoritized groups doing all this work or community work, and there's silence. And so if I come across and I say, hey, why is my stuff not being shown? Then I come across as petty, or I come across as not being a team player, which is a great microaggression that is usually used. And so if we want to really have people belong, the tools that ADR has that we've talked about, convening, creating those safe spaces, are there. We have them. We just need to refocus and reshift how we want to use them and for what purpose. So I hope that answers your question.
I'll quickly do thank you, Professor. That was terrific. Quick follow up on that, creating those safe spaces and having those difficult dialogues. I'm very proud, and allow me to do a shout out quickly to my colleague, Professor Tiffany Blondell. She's here somewhere and she's going to moderate the next panel. She and Professor Peter Robinson and myself, we have done some very difficult, managed, if you may, or tried to manage some very difficult conversations last year and the year before, especially as it applies to our law enforcement officers and our community leaders here in the LA region. And we have actually worked with close to 1,000 police officers here in LA to talk about de-escalation, talk about how to speak, how to discuss mediation skills, and they've been very open and recipient. We applaud the leadership there to include us and to be open to change and challenge. And the question here is, I'll just quickly pose to you, in that question, a thought. An African-American police officer spoke to me in a break last August in a training I was conducting for them in a facilitation. He comes up to me, he goes, I don't belong anywhere. On Facebook, people are criticizing me because I'm a policeman. At home, my family is questioning me because I'm a policeman and I'm Black. And my friends are disassociating with me. Where should I go? And I'm just leaving this question for you. There is no easy road here. This is not white and Black. This is not us coming to a conclusion, this society is good or this place is good. This sense of belonging is a difficult work that we have to create for all communities, if you may. I do want to, Aparna Gupta, you have messaged me. I think you have a question from audience, and then I'll go to my next people I see.
Actually, I'm going to be part of the audience and ask a question. I was going to ask, you know, we're talking about belonging, and I think one of the things that's so central to belonging is the ability to critique. If you cannot critique the institution, you don't truly belong. So I wanted to just hear a little bit from each of the panelists about, I think there's a central issue within legal education about whether ADR belongs in law school curricula, to what extent it belongs. And we see constantly our colleagues and our programs sort of dwindling, you know, or being taught by adjuncts. And so I'm wondering if this is a moment for ADR to really take the helm and say, yes, we belong, and here's how we can help you shape the dialogue. So I was hoping each of you could talk a little bit about the work you're doing at your home institutions to maybe create these spaces, and maybe if you have not been included in some of the DEI initiatives that every institution at every level took last summer, whether that was, you know, in sort of authenticity or in performance.
Who would like to go first, Okay, then I have two other questions. So let's be brief and please take. Let me ask Professor
I
Press.
think,
Oh, go
never
ahead.
mind, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things quickly. I think it's a huge question you ask, Aparna, so thanks for that. Just as a one other piece coming out of what the prior question, you know, I think it ties back to what Professor Bernard started us out with that chart and the intersectionality. And I think that both adds the complication, but it adds maybe the way that is the hope. Because nothing is very simple. And I think, you know, Professor Singh, your example also just makes that point that no one of us is in a single box. We all are in many different boxes. And that's I think the hope is that it leads to greater understanding across that. But in terms of that specific about, you know, does ADR belong? It's a huge question. I'll just say one piece on that. You know, early on, ADR was its own course. And then I think over the course of the last, you know, several years, maybe decades, there's been sort of a move to more embed the idea of problem solving, because it is really the work of lawyers, and each of us have said that in different ways. And the question is, you know, has the field and the professors who have devoted ourselves to this field in some ways done or not done a favor for ourselves by embedding so much? Because now it is each of I'm very fortunate. I work in an institution which has recognized that dispute resolution, as Pepperdine has, is its own unique, you know, niche, and it's important to maintain. But I think in a lot of other institutions, what's happened is, on the positive side, it is getting in bed. But what that's meant is that most of our colleagues don't just teach dispute resolution courses. They teach contracts, they teach civil procedure, they teach all of these other things, and they're asked. And so it's really, I think, been hard for us as the first generation of dispute resolution professors are retiring, of replacing them in meaningful ways with people who are really going to be able to maintain that focus on dispute resolution. So I'll leave it there, because I know, Homer, you wanted to.
Yeah, I tend to go to the practical. I hope it doesn't sound too crass. But when Sharon and I started doing this work, back when we started doing this work, there was something called the Hewlett Foundation, which underpinned financially a lot of the work. That's how membership organizations got started. I think we need another national funding of ADR at this point of change. How does it work in institutions? How should it work? How should it work in law schools and other programs? So I would like to see another national funding of these programs broadly. Hewlett made it possible for a number of organizations to come into existence, and could not have done so but for that kind of support.
Yes, just 1 second to add. I think that is a very important and profound question, whether ADR belongs or not in School of Laws. I mean, I think my short answer, it does. The question is how and what changes need to happen at American Bar Association and the way our schools are accredited, because that drives a lot of what deans have to do and how curriculums are shaped and formed. And there's always that debate between, are we preparing students to pass the bar, but at the same time social justice, but if they don't even pass the bar, then they won't be able to get there. And so, I mean, it's complex, but I do think that I don't see how you can be a successful lawyer in 2023, 24, 25, even today, if we don't figure this out, if we don't give our students what they need to really be able to go out there and engage the word. And I think part of this is that intersectionality that Crenshaw has so eloquently talked about. We need to start educating students and ourselves in how the structures of powers operate. We need to figure out how they operate so that then we can interrupt them and we can change them. And there's a quote that I love that is from Audre Lorde that she says, it may not be identical, but it's something like, there is no such thing as a single struggle, because we do not live single issue lives or something like that. So, and I love that quote, because actually she was ahead of her time with James Baldwin in understanding the importance of connecting with people across those intersectionalities in order to advance racial justice and women's rights. So I think that we should all be having these amazing conversations, not only how do we embed this in School of Laws, but how does it become sustainable, which is what didn't happen last time around, where we got all this, there was all this money and then some organizations died and others didn't. And I think it was because it wasn't institutionalized within our law schools and our academic institutions, where then the resources were allocated. And I always tell, deans and presidents and cabinet members, in academia, what we value, we fund and we measure. So let's start funding and measuring the things that matter so we can make the changes that we need.
You can see why we invited these three panelists this morning with us. You can't have, this is terrific. Thank you. Thank you all. We have last question, and Ms. Pelek Baker have been very patiently waiting. So let's end this panel with this last question, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the enriching dialogue. I'm a social psychologist. Actually look critically about psychology from a social constructionist point of view. I want to say a couple of things. One is that I started leading dialogues in the Middle East back like 25 years ago. And one thing that really struck with me and shaped my my journey is that Arabs, Israelis, in Jews and Arabs dialogues started saying, and rightfully they said, enough of dialogue. We want equality. And I think it's so relevant to what's happening in this country now. I live here now, I'm Israeli. And it really changed my scholarly work and practice. And I want to draw our attention to really structural matters that I see that they are overlooked. We live in Western monologic, hegemonic society. The center is the individual, not the relationships or the context. So just think about that, especially in America, what it does to the relationship between the self and the other. If we focus on the self, we actually create fragmentation and division because the self is more important than the other. So how can we achieve EDI, collaborative efforts, or anything if we think that my voice is not as equal as the individual, the other individual, because I am like the I is more important than the other. So just the beginning of, the structure of our thinking creates divisiveness. So, and actually all the EDI efforts are actually uphill battle all the time because we are not thinking this way. That's why we don't have empathy toward the other and we're just thinking about ourselves. So this is something I think that we need to take into consideration. It really creates everyday fragmentation.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Ms. Pelek Baker, for the point. And in fact, your point was, as you were speaking, very interesting, was also in some parts being reflected in the chats. And I want to read a couple of things, if you allow me, folks. One is by Professor Alan Deason, our colleague from Ohio State. an amazing scholar and a teacher as well. And she says there are some moves to expand what is evaluated in bar exams to include some problem-solving skills that we associate with dispute resolution. Let's see what happens. So I'm assuming, Professor Deason, you are involved with that, and I appreciate that. And I know you and Professor Press has written an article, which you'll be sharing with everybody, the draft off, if you may. We also have a comment by Professor Gunning, and she talks about diversity as being invited to the party, and belonging means that you're asked to dance. And I've also heard that true belonging means that you get to choose at least some of the music that is played at the dance. I will end this panel by sharing a quick story. A couple of years ago, I attended a diversity conference in Texas, which belonged to law school administrators. And one of the themes that was brought up is a question that was raised was also the question of tenure. Who is getting the short-term appointments and who's getting tenure? Who gets the dean titles and assistant dean titles? Something to think about, as all of our panelists have raised these questions beautifully to make us think on how to bring equality slowly but surely through action, not just through talking. Would you all please join me in thanking Professor Sharon Press, Professor Jackie Guzman, and Professor Homer LaRue. Please join me. Unmute yourself for a second, if that's okay, and go back to muting, and please join me in thanking them. Please unmute yourself. Thank you. This conversation is a start, friends. This is not the end. So we'll share. You can find their emails online very easily, but if you need to connect with any of our terrific panelists, I'm happy to personally send you a note and connect you with them. Aparna, please tell us, what are we doing next?
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, everyone. We'll take a 10-minute break. We're right on time. Please meet us back here at 10:30. Don't go away. Our next panel is a blockbuster as well. It's looking at addressing bias in process and dispute resolution process. So we wanted to do a larger scope view for the first panel and look at sort of conflict diversity within conflict resolution education practice in the field. And the next, we're going to shift our focus a little more micro and have Professor Blondell start us off. So we'll get started at 10:30, take a break, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
We will leave this Zoom on, so you don't have to log off. You can just keep your microphone off and the camera off, but we will not close the Zoom. Thank you all. Thank you, professors.
Wonderful. We'll get started in just about a minute.
All right, please come back, folks. We're going to get started with another star.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I wanted to save a surprise. It's Friday, after all. Before we get started on our next panel, I wanted to introduce to you my colleague, Professor and Judge Tiffany Williams, who's going to offer some brief remarks that provide a bridge from the first panel into our second conversation. Professor Williams is the Associate Director of Advocacy, Faith, and Empowerment here at Pepperdine, where she teaches upper level courses and leads initiatives on spiritual development, professional advocacy, and women's empowerment. She's a former New Jersey administrative law judge, and she brings her judicial experience into the classroom and for the law school community. Judge Williams will focus her remarks on the ethics of furthering racial justice through the lens of dispute resolution. And on a personal note, when I think about Judge Williams, the quote from MLK comes to mind that says, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, say that I was a drum major for peace, say that I was a drum major for righteousness, and all the other things, the shallow things will not matter. She is a true champion for justice and equity throughout her longstanding career, and I'm just so pleased to introduce her to our community.
Thank you so much for that very gracious and warm introduction. And if I am able to be those things at Pepperdine, it's because of the partnership that I often have with you, Aparna, and with Sukhsimran. So thank you. It's appropriate that we're together today in this conversation. I was very moved by the call to action that this entire symposium is bringing together. And as I was asked to speak, I am passionate about ethics. I see some of my ethics students in the chat, my former ethics students in the chat, so they will know that I'm very passionate about thinking about our ethical obligations. So as we are talking about, even in this forthcoming panel, ADR in practice, and how does diversity and inclusion and a real call to action of using the tools that are embodied in this entire body of work that we call ADR, how can it be used and leveraged at this time? First, recognizing that this is a prime time for ADR professionals, those who are lawyers and non-lawyers, to step up and to step into our calling. Having served as a judge for 6 years, certainly sensitized me to the skills and the power that we have as neutrals in the legal profession in order to move hard issues, to remove barriers. And we are certainly living in a time where that is our call. So in the last panel, Aparna asked a very heady question that I wanted to wrap into my remarks quickly too, about the role of ADR in law school curricula. So as we're also getting ready to talk more about the role of ADR in the practice and for furthering racial justice, we can't ignore that law school is where we prepare the next generation of professionals. I think absolutely our law school curricula should incorporate more ADR focus, and by doing it even in substantive classes. So, even thinking about ethics in my ethics class, teaching law students about their ethical obligation to use the practice of law to further racial justice. So, even in my remarks today, I want to make some corollaries between the ethical requirements that we have as lawyers in the profession and how we can use them in ADR and how they may empower the next generation of law students, and for us to educate them to do such as well. So the ABA model rules in the preamble give some very heady language and that we can hold on to as legal professionals and as those who are non-lawyers working in ADR. One of my favorite quotes says, as a public citizen, a lawyer should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of service rendered by the legal profession. We can substitute the word lawyer for, as a public citizen, an ADR professional should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of service rendered by the legal profession. It goes further to say, as a member of a learned profession, a lawyer, we can substitute an ADR professional, should cultivate knowledge of the law beyond its use for clients, employ that knowledge in reform of the law, and work to strengthen legal education. ADR has a role in law school to train the next generation of lawyers how to take these powerful principles of convening others, of mediating disputes, and use it to improve the quality of life of others in our society. A lawyer should further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law and the justice system, because legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation and support to maintain their authority. So ADR professionals also can fit in here with this important ethical mission to further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law. We certainly saw a decision by a jury this week that strengthened our confidence in the rule of law. What we also can't ignore is the emotional outpouring that also came because so many in this country doubted and wondered whether it would be the right decision, whether Officer Chauvin would be convicted. And the confidence in the rule of law has been shattered for many people in this country, to the point that many do not even believe that the justice system can possibly give them any justice. So we have an ethical responsibility as lawyers and as non-lawyers who are in the ADR field to further the public's understanding and build that confidence in the rule of law. So therefore, lawyers and ADR professionals should devote professional time and resources and use civic influence to ensure equal access to our system of justice for all those who, because of economic or social barriers, cannot afford or secure adequate legal counsel. We can't ignore that ADR also is a powerful tool because it can even be a more accessible form of justice for others, even and particularly those that are looking to further racial justice. And if these things are all true, absolutely we need more diverse professionals at the table implementing ADR tools and techniques. So we see the statistics are pretty clear that we don't. And as a former practicing attorney, I never had a person of color that was an arbitrator in cases, and I did a lot of complex commercial litigation as well, where we used a lot of arbitrators, never had a person of color. It was rare that either side even could, as they say, find qualified people of color. So that was an attitude and a farce as well. I wasn't in a position of power at the time as a partner to have the level of influence that I would love to have had to make a difference in some of those decisions. But we're living in a time today where it is our ethical responsibility to challenge and shatter that sort of thinking as well. So I'm excited to continue and listening to the conversation as we talk further, and Professor Blondell moderates the next segment. But I just wanted to be before you today to remind us that furthering diversity, inclusion, which for our society right now and our profession includes furthering racial justice and changing legal institutions, that we have an ethical and a professional responsibility to do so. So the time to act is now. Thank you all for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judge Williams. I will say quickly two words and then move over to introduce Professor Blondell. And that is, Judge Williams, we all of us know, has been a passionate advocate at the bench and now off the bench. Luckily, she joined our faculty, and I've just personally learned so much by being with her over the last couple of years. And she and I are working in India and other cultures, and her passion is just amazing to watch. And thank you for your presence today. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for speaking those words, including equal access to systems of justice and the ethical challenge that poses for all of us. Folks, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephanie Blondell. Professor Blondell is my colleague, a dear colleague here at the Straus Institute. She is Associate Professor of Law, and she is Associate Director for the Straus Institute. She is also Director of the Masters in Dispute Resolution, which is MDR program, for which you do not need a law degree to apply to. And she has taught and teaches mediation theory and practice. I love her course on psychology of conflict. She's also taught criminal law for us. What is it she cannot teach? Okay, one thing, and besides, she has led other programs around the nation, like in King County and in Seattle and others. I just want to personally introduce her and say one thing. I've had a pleasure of working with Professor Blondell for close to 5 years now, and I can tell you, she is an amazing person to work with. She is a terrific trainer and teacher, and has worked on social justice issues with me and others, devoted fully, and brings the passion and change for her students. Professor Blondell, I know I did not do justice, but with our time, would you please take it away from me?
Such a kind introduction. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Singh. So we're going to take a little bit of a shift in perspective, but move forward with the same theme with our next panel. And so the title of the panel is ADR's Potential and Limitations in Advancing Equity and Justice for Disenfranchised Individuals and Communities. So this question that was raised in the last panel about, does ADR actually hinder social justice movements because of the flexibility, because of the confidentiality, because of the inability for people to have advocacy in order to leverage their needs in order to create belonging? That's what we're going to be exploring with three incredible panelists today. I will introduce each one of them one by one, as Professor Singh did, and I will just say that it's been an amazing couple of weeks being able to dive into the research that they've done. All of them weave together these papers where it's you kind of almost want to meditate on every sentence because they're so rich. And so I encourage all of you to give yourself that experience of really simmering in their work. There's nothing like a great article to kind of inspire you back into the work. The first person that I'm going to introduce, and our first speaker, is Professor Isabel Gunning. Professor Isabel Gunning is a professor of law at Southwestern Law School, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But more than that, she is truly an Angelino. Well, I don't know where you were born, Professor Gunning, but you serve our community in ways that are really appreciated and recognized across Los Angeles. She serves as a commissioner on the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations, and she also, during her tenure, presided over the hearings which led to the report in 2020, Redefining Policing Within Our Community. Amazing work. Professor Gunning also, before coming to Southwestern, was a criminal defense attorney with the public defender. She served in DC as a human rights attorney with the South Africa Project on the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the Law. And currently she's a professor of law teaching in the area of conflict resolution, alternative dispute resolution, along with evidence, interviewing, and counseling, with research interests in this multicultural dialogue and the search for, the creation of shared values in the context of racially and socially defined power. Really an important conversation in our field. So, Professor Gunning, we're inviting each of our speakers to speak for 10 or 15 minutes on what they want to speak about, but I also do have to ask that, as you say, you also want to choose some of the music that's being played. So I will put that in there as well. What music do you want to be played at this dance that we're doing here today? Take it away, Professor Gunning.
Well, thank you, Professor Blondell. That was really a very gracious introduction. And I do have to flag Professor Singh that I was grateful that you flagged me, but I was building on something that my good friend Homer LaRue said about starting the dance. So I do want to acknowledge him. So good morning, everybody. It's still morning, or for those of you who it's not, good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be with, I know my own panelists are great. I know Felix and Homer from before. I did not know Professor Guzman, all fabulous people. I mean, this has just been terrific, and I'm grateful, Aparna, for this invitation to be a part of this. Really, truly grateful. I started thinking about the possibility of justice along with fairness and mediation for disenfranchised individuals about 15 years ago. When I wrote the articles that explored my concerns, I was teaching ADR at the time, and I also was practicing as a mediator in disenfranchised communities through my work with the Los Angeles County Bar Association's Dispute Resolution Services Project, specifically their Gay and Lesbian Mediation Project, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's Martin Luther King Jr. Dispute Resolution Center, and the Asian Pacific American Dispute Resolution Center. And I believe then, as I believe now, that ADR had positive benefits for disenfranchised communities. So it seemed logical to engage ADR's critics. And since I'd been previously writing from a critical race theory perspective in the international arena, I was most focused on engaging the critics of ADR, most notably, of course, Richard Delgado's seminal work, Fairness and Formality, Minimizing the Risk of Prejudice and Alternative Dispute Resolution. And I wanted to explore the studies of the day, which at that time revealed that there were negative results for minorities when engaging in mediation in contrast to litigation. My approach in both pieces rested upon a critical race theory approach. My goal was in thinking about the kind of work I was doing, individual mediations that involved the LGBTQ+ and persons of color community, and how the negative impacts of mediation pointed out by Professor Delgado might be mitigated. My focus was primarily on settlement-oriented mediation. And I was, of course, concerned with the ways that larger forces like racism impact on the individuals, mediators and parties alike involved in the mediation process. And at the time, I just deconstructed two of the key tenets for mediation, party self-determination and mediator neutrality, as two sites to explore how systemic racism impacts the process. A lot of my discussion was around storytelling and narrative. And I started with the part of narrative theory that points out how the first narrative told will generally take on primacy as other subsequent narratives strive to fit in. Whoever gets to or volunteers to speak first generally will tell a story with plot and characters with assigned roles that have moral assessments. Who's the good character? Who's the bad character? And then subsequent speakers typically will employ the same series of events along with the same moral code or interpretive framework used in the first, because they generally want to tell a version of the story that repositions them in a more positive light. I explore how repositioning involves the two speakers warring over positions, which ultimately involve a struggle over competing definitions and descriptions of social relations. Now, all of these competing definitions are drawn from the history and norms and cultural myths of our larger society. And when speakers draw on the society's cultural myths, they must choose some relevant socially constructed category or identity group for themselves and for others. These identity groups based on common biological characteristics, common or equivalent histories, or similar worldviews like race, gender, family, age, sexual orientation, immigration status, or organization groups based on work experiences or skills, all provide the participants with a series of pre-existing possible stories within which the participants' narrative may fit. These pre-existing stories or cultural myths may be positive or negative, but for a society like our own, in which systemic racism is embedded, the cultural myths that exist for Black people and other people of color are largely negative compared to the range of positive cultural myths for whites. And here is one way in which Black people then get disadvantaged in the mediation process. By ignoring the impact of these socially or culturally derived frameworks, mediators allow for injustice and unfairness against disenfranchised individuals to occur, whether intentional or not. I argued for an activist mediation that shares something with the transformative model in that it is not singularly focused on settlement as a result. Not all disputes are suitable for a mediation type dispute resolution method, and sometimes the evidence of that is precisely that the parties decide not to settle. I argue that just as mediators typically have an opening statement that outlines ground rules, there won't be any interruptions. You're not going to name call everybody. Speak openly and honestly. We could and should openly include shared goals of justice and fairness and the possibility of power imbalance in the same opening so that those issues too can be engaged in the mediation process by all parties. My work was fairly criticized by Christopher Harper in Mediator as Peacemaker, the case for activist transformative narrative mediation, and I've come to accept his suggestion that mediators use even more of the approach from narrative theory to support parties in deconstructing the initial narrative in order to unpack the taken for granted assumptions that give meaning to social practices, personal experiences, structural arrangements, and societal institutions. Deconstruction can enable parties to discard the old assumptions and create new meanings and more positive narratives using newly constructed shared notions of fairness and justice. Since my work on activist mediation, I have been blessed really to be able to work more in the community facilitation arena here in Los Angeles. I've worked as a facilitator for Days of Dialogues, which many of you may know. It's a group that was founded back in 1995 in the aftermath of the O.J. Simpson verdict, when then, and again now, City Council person Mark Ridley Thomas, he's circulated through other positions for us, but he's back, noticed the racially divergent views on the verdict and called a meeting to help diffuse the tensions. And this led to the first citywide Days of Dialogue, and the program has continued since under the extraordinary leadership of Avis Ridley Thomas, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. I've also done facilitation for Trust Talks, an interfaith group created by several religious leaders who serve downtown Los Angeles, which sponsored a limited series of community dialogues focused on homelessness in downtown LA. And I've been privileged to do some interesting work with community-focused public hearings and facilitated discussions, part of which was something that Professor Blondell mentioned, our police hearings, through my work with the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations. Now, I've been working for too long, for sure, on pulling together my ideas from these experiences and writing about what a group process, dialogue, for supporting communities in or through crisis might look like. I don't have a grand structure to present to you today, but I can say that I'm exploring two things that I hope we'll be able to talk about. The first is that I again return to the transformative approach to conflict resolution. I had long been attracted to transformative mediation. Its premise that, quote, human identity is a balance between concern for the self and concern for others is a philosophical and frankly spiritual foundation with which I agree. And its focus on supporting parties to become more empowered around their sense of self and to become more empowered around recognition of others, thereby becoming more responsive to the other's perspective, are significant core values that allow for conflict resolution to have deeper impacts on the participants than the more contemporary, settlement-oriented Western model. But back in the day, I criticized the transformative model's attachment to an uncritical form of party self-determination and mediator neutrality as well. And as I'm reading now about transformative dialogue, I see aspects both wonderful and concerning. As I see great strengths, citing from the Eric Clevin, Robert Baruch Bush, and Judith Saul's Living with No, Political Polarization and Transformative Dialogue, the idea that rather than people looking to get to yes, community dialogues may need to focus on how people can live with no, I find a helpful and timely shift in focus in the broadest sense for community processes. But not surprisingly, I see the same problems in transformative dialogue that I saw in transformative mediation. While there's discussion on how the right kind of dispute resolution process, quote, must give people a voice and allow them to choose how to understand themselves and their relation to others, end quote, and that, quote, each individual has a unique understanding of their own identity, which is connected to their unique history and life experience, end quote. There's no discussion on how each person's understanding of him, her, themselves, and his, her, their identity is situated in and permeated by the larger culture, along with the systemic racism and other social hierarchies that are embedded in American culture. The second point, and it's already been echoed by some other speakers. I know Professor Singh mentioned this and Professor Press. I believe that the right kind of dispute resolution process should seek both to support individual participant shifts in empowerment, along with shifts in participants' recognition of others, healings, if you will, and also to support and promote justice in the process and substance. And if we support that, we need to define justice. And as I mentioned, Professor Singh and Professor Press both flagged restorative justice, the justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. And consequently, I agree with them. I think we need to very explicitly connect community dialogues to the restorative justice movement. And I want to be clear, because I want to build upon the work of Dr. Fania Davis in her book, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, where she articulates a restorative justice approach that is inextricably integrated with a racial justice and social justice stance. To quote her, healing interpersonal harm requires a commitment to transforming the context in which the harm occurs. The socio-historical conditions and institutions that are structured precisely to perpetuate harm. This commitment may mean viewing restorative justice as not only healing individual harm, but also transforming social structures and institutions that are themselves purveyors of massive harm. And I heard that echoed in Professor Von Guzman, who I only met today, but already adore. This extraordinary past year, and we've been flagging it, where we have endured and survived the physical, psychological, financial, economic impacts of the pandemic, where the murder of Afro-Americans by police officers finally has moved from trauma felt largely by African Americans ourselves alone to moral outrage shared by a multiracial group of Americans and people globally, frankly, and right up to the deadly attacks on the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. All of this much teaches us that we cannot ignore the deep-seated inequities baked into our nation's history and institutions. And I too obviously agree that we in the ADR community have a role in this movement for peace, combined with justice in our nation and frankly, the planet. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation on how we go about doing just that.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gunning. I think we all see a little bit about what we're in for here through your comments, just really insightful comments that raise important issues about mediation, at least the orthodoxy of mediation as it's been known today. So you start with Delgado, and thank you for that original piece, which is so important, challenging party self-determination and neutrality. And your call is powerful. And I got the tingles while I was listening to your call in terms of transformative dialogue as well as restorative justice and the inextricably linked context as you quoted. So I have more questions for you, particularly as someone who's written about the mediation model, kind of discreetly the mediation model, and is such a talented mediator. So we'll hold those as we hear from our other panelists. Next, we have Andrew Mamo. And Professor Mamo is at Northern Illinois University College of Law. He's an assistant professor. Andrew has been in the academy for a long time, however. He has been, after getting his JD and his PhD, he was at the Harvard Mediation Clinical Program for the last few years, which is where I met him. And now he's landed at Northern Illinois University College of Law and has written a really exciting piece that's forthcoming in the Ohio Journal. Andrew teaches in the areas of contracts, business associations, dispute resolution, mediation, and negotiation, and was previously a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School and a clinical instructor in the dispute systems design program there. At Harvard, he started to work on this piece that he's going to be speaking about today, and he has integrated critical legal theory, ADR, behavioral economics. I believe Professor Mamo has a undergraduate degree in physics. You will definitely see this absolutely phenomenal integration of so many fields as he talks about ADR and the future of ADR in terms of social justice and neutrality. So Professor Mamo, we welcome you today. We're glad you're here. And please share with us what you want to share with us today.
Thank you very much. And I'm not sure that any of the physics will be coming in, so don't worry if that was a distant memory. But thank you for the kind words. And also, just as a junior scholar, it's tremendous. It's a real honor to be here with so many people whose works have really been inspirational and educational to me, and really provide a lot of the foundation for my thinking about ADR. So my work really picks up on some more recent efforts to think about racial justice as being not just a matter of doing the right thing, but something that's also just in the interests of everyone, including being in the interests of white people. And that led me to think about the connections between ADR and the interest-based methods of ADR and of negotiation in particular, the connections between that and critical race theory, and in particular, the interest convergence thesis of Derek Bell, which argues that progress in advancing the interests of Black people has only occurred when it has also served the interests of white people, and only to the extent that it has also served the interests of white people. And so Derek Bell's insight has generated just a tremendous amount of energy toward advancing racial equality by thinking about framing it in terms of the interests of white people. And it's also led to efforts to use interest-based dispute resolution as a way to advance racial justice. But there's a fundamental asymmetry that Bell picks up on, that the advancement of the interests of Black people in his thesis is contingent upon satisfying the interests of white people, but the reverse is not true. And any progress made also remains remarkably fragile, subject to white people continuing to see it as being in their interest. And so for Bell, this is not just a descriptive argument about how progress has happened in America or not happened, but rather he's also framed it as a jurisprudential argument that American law contains a presumption that the interests of white people will not be disturbed, and that progress for people of color can happen only as long as it doesn't challenge that basic premise. So the claim that we can advance racial justice by finding interest-based solutions to our problems, I think misses perhaps the deeper significance of Bell's work. And if we accept Bell's argument, then what consequences might follow for ADR? This is really what's been driving a lot of my recent thinking. So the first consequence, as I see it, is that we need to revisit the relationship between legal rights-based mechanisms and interest-based ones. And so the interest-based tradition of dispute resolution privileges mechanisms that engage with party interests because those are supposed to be able to provide resolutions that actually address what parties want, address their interests. Engaging with interests, when appropriate, is seen to be normatively superior to resolving disputes on the basis of rights or on the basis of power contests. And the interests of each party define the scale of utility for that party, and a mediation or a negotiation strives to reach an outcome that's better for each party as measured in terms of their utility than their best alternative. This is basically, getting TS 101. So we need to pay attention to how parties come to define their interests. We've seen social movements successfully changing how parties understand their interests. Consider how today many universities and businesses and courts and other organizations are consciously starting to prioritize diversity. And even if these statements about diversity can sometimes seem superficial, I think they still can meaningfully shift the terrain to the extent that now improving diversity becomes an explicit factor in measuring the value of possible outcomes for organizational change. And for example, I saw this in my past role as a clinical instructor when some clinical students of mine were able to counsel a state agency that agency's articulation of its own institutional interests was flawed for not really capturing the importance of diversification for things that they had recognized as being important to them. And of course, in this particular instance, the client's receptivity to this counsel reflected, I think, the profound changes in consciousness that have been wrought by artists and activists and academics and others over the past several years in really raising these issues and making it something that is just part of the air that we breathe these days. But however the interests of parties are defined, it's essential to the models of interest-based dispute resolution that there still remains recourse to rights-based processes, such as litigation, which provide alternatives that can protect parties in a negotiation or in a mediation from exploitation at the bargaining table. But if we look to Bell's work, what if there is no real meaningful recourse to rights? If the most fundamental assumption required for interest-based practices to be non-exploitative, that legal rights provide an effective backstop, what if that no longer holds true? We all know in ADR the mantra that bargaining takes place in the shadow of the law, but what does that mean if Bell is correct about American law privileging white interests over Black rights? For Bell, forging moments of interest convergence was not something that was desirable in itself, but rather it was a tactic born of necessity in a legal system in which the rights of Black people were always precarious. And then what of getting TS's prescription for resolving disputes by appealing to objective standards? The body of Bell's work suggests that those objective standards are really anything but. Some common sources of objective standards that we use in ADR include legal precedents, market values, and both of these may well be biased. For example, the metrics by which programs to advance racial equality are evaluated may emphasize the concerns of white people, as Bell argued, in the context of affirmative action. Even as affirmative action programs survive legal challenges, the logic of the court opinions is that these programs only survive because the costs borne by white people are still outweighed by the benefits of such programs for white people. Legal standards, that is, center whiteness. And market values are, if anything, even more problematic. For example, you may have seen last summer a case that really is still striking to me that was reported in the New York Times of an interracial couple that had their house appraised and then saw a 40% increase in the appraised value of their home simply by removing photos of the Black family members from the house. So our theories teach us to utilize objective metrics in order to reach principled resolutions rather than those reflecting the raw exercise of power. But closer investigation reveals that those objective metrics that we are taught to rely upon remain deeply biased. I think what we're left with is the Foucauldian recognition that the creation and invocation of objectivity just is the exercise of power. And so the familiar tripartite structure of resolving disputes on the basis of interests versus on the basis of rights versus on the basis of power starts to dissolve away. And the real conflict concerns who defines standards of objectivity and how. And a second major consequence for ADR concerns the idea of coming together across differences, which is something that we've been discussing today and is a major theme in our polarized times, and something whose limitations Derek Bell well understood. Because as Bell surveyed the history of American race relations, coming together across differences meant in practice forging unity across the divides, whether political, sectional, or class-based, the divides that fragmented the white community by emphasizing the otherness and the marginality of Black Americans. And for Bell, this was as true of the founding era and the compromises built into the Constitution as it was of the reconciliation between North and South at the end of Reconstruction by downplaying the issue of slavery in favor of unifying concepts of honor or love of one's homeland. And it's as true yet again of the de-radicalization of the memory of the civil rights movement that was alluded to earlier in this event. Bell recognized that there can be no us without a them, and that as far as we expand the circle of belonging, there always remains some boundary that's defined by exclusion. And so from this perspective, privileging notions of community without acknowledging the differences that exist that divide us can be as pernicious as privileging notions of essentialized difference without acknowledging what is shared, because both fail to recognize the fundamentally contested nature of belonging. That is, community is always a question and not an answer in itself. And how we address the question of how to define the community bears upon the previous one of who gets to define the applicable standards of objectivity or legitimacy and how. And a third consequence is that the struggle is going to remain. The resolutions of particular disputes represent at best partial and temporary victories, but they leave the basic problem of racism untouched. So for Bell, recognizing the permanence of racism, as he put it, was liberatory. No longer could we believe that the right intervention would purge our body politic of this disease. Instead, he urged us to join with Camus in finding joy in the Sisyphean struggle for justice, which is the one thing that does remain within our control. So what can dispute resolution contribute to this project? Recognizing that there's no clean delineation between discussions of interest and the raw exercise of power, and recognizing that the composition of our community is always tentative and contested. Without the stick of litigation or the carrot of value-creating deal-making, it's the power of moral suasion through demonstration and protest that provides an invitation to the endless task of working through competing understandings of a just future, both in collaboration and in contestation. And empathy and dialogue can foster understanding, but we must also recognize the incommensurability of experiences when necessary. Once we recognize that our ability to understand the world is deeply shaped by our experiences, then we can recognize that when we try to empathetically project ourselves into the situation of the other, as I think we're called upon to do, we're still seeing the world through our own eyes, through lenses that we've shaped through a lifetime of experiences and that continue to shape our perceptions of the world in idiosyncratic ways. There's a deep unknowability in others that empathy simply cannot transcend. And genuine dialogue requires participants to open themselves up to the unexpected, to the possibilities of personal transformation by contact with that unexpected and that unknowability. So the most profound disputes today implicate deep structural conflicts involving racism or misogyny or anti-Semitism, for example. And thanks to movements such as Me Too or the Movement for Black Lives, we know that many dyadic disputes are constituted by and continue to constitute histories of oppression. And I think increasingly disputants situate their particular disputes within these broader narratives. And this raises two difficulties. On the one hand, the impulse to take a stand on these deep structural conflicts can lead us to ignore the nuances of individual disputes and the complexities of the individual lives affected. On the other hand, the impulse to delve into the nuances and ambiguities of individual disputes can lead us to perpetuate structural injustices. Forgiveness and understanding, for example, tend to be invoked far more easily for white people in America, and particularly for white men, than for people of color. And our training, as lawyers generally and as ADR practitioners specifically, all encourage us to particularize disputes. And I take it to be critical race theory's key lesson for our field, that this instinct comes with a cost that we must account for. So engagement with the logic of social movements, I think, needs to be part of our toolkit, because we, as dispute resolution professionals, must work with dynamics that are happening at different scales and in different conflict registers if we are to understand contemporary disputes individually and as part of larger systems. We recognize that the resolution of individual disputes can aggregate to have big societal effects, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding dispute systems, because these systems are complex. Maybe that's where the physics comes in. And it's our responsibility as dispute resolution professionals in a moment of social transformation to understand not only how social movements affect the resolution of dyadic disputes, but also how the resolution of those disputes affects the vitality of movements for social transformation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Mamo. Really, really interesting. And so well said. You've really aptly, I think, encapsulated a lot of complexity, as does Professor Eric Dunning. So I so appreciate you giving us an overview and kind of look into Bell's work, particularly interest convergence, which Professor Gunning does too in our article. But yesterday I was talking to Professor Mamo and I asked him specifically to talk about that. I think that this notion of, the interests of Blacks will only be met if it meets white people's interests, has a direct kind of connection to the ways that some of us may be rethinking the way that we practice as mediators and dispute resolvers. So thank you for that. And then raising, all that you have also about objectivity and power and their inner relationship, I think brings us into the next questions that we'll have as a panel about the overall structure and the call, which is how to not particularize these disputes, but engage in social movements as part of our ADR toolkit, as you say. Like, I think that will be the question. What does that mean? How do we engage as practitioners in that? Really exciting. So we now are going to be moving to our third panelist. And we've kind of gone from, an application to mediation to dispute systems and the field a little more generally. Now we're moving to Professor Amsler. Lisa Amsler is a distinguished professor at Indiana University, Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. So I really appreciate Professor Amsler coming in with PP, an MPA, or I don't know if you're an MPA or an MPP school, but you can tell us that perspective. And so she is approaching us with policy and systems design. And I think some of the way that she may talk about this might be refreshing for some of the practitioners in the field. She's served on the O'Neill faculty since 1992. She's an expert in collaborative governance, public engagement, dispute resolution, labor law, with over 100 published works. Really incredible. Her 2005 article on new governance practice was named one of the 75 most influential articles of the past 75 years by Public Administration Review. Her lead article on workplace mediation and published in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review is on the Social Science Research Network's all-time top 10 list of most downloaded articles on conflict resolution. So in other words, you've heard of her. Professor Amsler has received national awards from the ABA, and she was there honored for outstanding scholarship foundational to the field of dispute resolution. Her other honors go on and on. It is a pleasure to have her here speaking about the redress program. I believe that's what she's going to speak about today. Lisa, Aparna's going to handle your slides. So if you can just let her know when and how you need them. Professor Amsler.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank Judge Williams for her comments before our panel. And also I'd like to thank Professors Singh, Blondell, Gupta, our panel this morning, the opening remarks with Professor Bernard, and dear and old friends in the field, including Professor LaRue, Professor Press, and Professor Von Guzman. It's been wonderful to listen to everyone's remarks as well as my co-panelists this afternoon. Just to explain before we get to slides, so I was, let's see where to start. I feel like I need to start with the fact that when I was 10, I was in a segregated white elementary school in Mobile, Alabama. And when John F. Kennedy was shot and there was an announcement about his assassination, my class clapped. And I started crying because my parents were closet socialists and I knew this was not a good thing. And I was sent to the ladies' room by the teacher to compose myself. So it's been a long journey from there. We moved to New York, where my mother's family was from, when shortly after that event. And I've got a picture I put in my college dorm room that I got from Goodwill for 99 cents, a photograph of Hermes, who is the god of communication, actually. And the Greek statues are white now, but they were actually all painted and colorful when originally made. So that's why I haven't taken it down in my Zoom calls. So I went from that to being a labor lawyer eventually for union and then management, and then became a partner in a management law firm for a decade, representing school boards and municipalities, and then into academia, initially teaching legal writing, and then to the O'Neill School. So I was at the law school on campus and then cross campus. The O'Neill School is like having one of each kind on Noah's Ark. So we've got political scientists, sociologists, environmental scientists, lots of economists, and maybe a couple of other lawyers. So it's always been wonderful for me to still be part of my lawyer community. And my comments today are about what I believe, and I have taught at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for a year and a half as a visitor, and I visited at Hastings. And it's my feeling about what we need to teach law students in terms of how to analyze systemic racism. And with that, if we could start with my slides, I'll try to whip through them pretty quickly. All right, so this question of how to analyze systemic racism has led me to my current work, which is work at the community level on bringing multiple and diverse voice, and particularly heightening the power and effect on policymaking of diverse voices, but bringing voices from different perspectives together in the process of public engagement and policymaking. So how did I get to Ostrom? Well, Eleanor Ostrom was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics as a trained political scientist in political economy. And she was at the Indiana University Bloomington Political Science Department and Ostrom Workshop for many years. And this framework, the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, was developed there over time. And I think that this provides a very simple, accessible tool for law students to think about systems and action arenas. So just to lay it out quickly, the idea is this is a very general framework, the most general kind of framework. There are theories and models nested inside it, like restorative justice, for example, is a theory or a model. And within this notion of the framework, there's an action arena. For example, when we're having a mediation process with people in the room, or an arbitration process, or a public engagement process, or a dialogue, each of those is an action arena. It's nested in institutions. And there are independent variables that shape those institutions, including, Ostrom tells us, most importantly, 3 categories: rules on paper and rules in use, or the law, the physical environment, and communities as an environment. I'm going to focus on the law. Let's go to the next slide. So in the action arena, within the action arena, in the mediation, for example, we've got participants, their positions or roles. What are the potential outcomes? What are the allowable actions or the outcome function? How much control do disputants and participants have over those outcomes? What information do they have, if any, about what can happen in that action arena? And then what are the costs and benefits? So my previous last name was Bingham. As Lisa Bingham, I published the first empirical paper entitled Employment Arbitration, the Repeat Player Effect on Mandatory or Adhesive Arbitration. And when you apply this to mandatory or adhesive arbitration, we look at allowable actions. It's no longer allowable in arbitration to have class arbitrations. The employers or corporations that design the clauses can write that out of the clause. They can create incentives and deterrents in those clauses by shifting who pays attorney's fees. So if you haven't looked at Lost in the Fine Print, the little 20-minute video that I show in my dispute resolution class, narrated by Robert Reich, please look at it. So this is just an example of how simple a set of terms can be for students to analyze a context. Let's go to the next slide. The Ostrom talks about collective action. She started, her dissertation was about water rights in California. And now, right now, California, where this event is mostly going on, although we're from all over the world that are participating and watching it, has a new statute that actually is mandating collective action, includes in terms of managing access to water and water rights. And my co-author, Jan Martinez, is involved with research on that, collaborating with people at the Ostrom workshop. So Elinor Ostrom wrote about the notion of social norms and principles that are characteristic of successful institutions for collective action. And I believe that collective action and thinking about how we teach students to engage in collective action and have an obligation to engage in collective action builds on what my fellow panelists and scholars have just finished speaking about. So Elinor talks about looking at the local rules in use. Now, my research right now is on intrastate preemption. The project that I'm working on right now is funded not to Indiana University, but to local participant ground up community action organizations by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And my piece of it, in addition to providing supplementary funding on my research account, is to research how the state of Indiana has passed statutes that prohibit communities from adopting ordinances of various kinds that would empower different people in their communities, recognizing that intrastate preemption is also what was Jim Crow. I think we need to take another look at what's happening with these local rules. In addition, members, meaning the whole community, might participate in making and modifying the rules and selecting their own monitors who are accountable. So police are monitors of rules who are accountable in theory to the community. But in Indiana, our open door law actually prohibits disclosure of files regarding police discipline in cases of police harm, physical harm to people in the community. So this question of sanctions, what are the sanctions? What are the sanctions for police misconduct? How are they enforced and implemented? What kind of transparency is there about hearings that go on pursuant to union contracts? And I am a fierce advocate of the collective bargaining, but the rules need to be fair to everybody. This notion of low-cost arenas to resolve conflict among users and officials, community mediation. I've done research back in 2010 on community mediation centers with a sample of 350 of them. There are only 150 now. The grantee in Bloomington is our community mediation center that I was a founding board member of. We need them back. Think about founding one or supporting the one you've got. Next slide, please. So Ostrom talked about needing dispute resolution structures, but she didn't write about it. My colleagues, Jen Martinez and I published a book, and Stephanie Smith published a book last year, Stanford University Press, trying to fill up that gap. And it's a book that some people can use as a textbook in seminars on dispute system design. But this framework, the analytic framework, started out as Jan and Stephanie's article in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review on this question of how do we analyze these systems. And we added context and culture thanks to suggestions by Mariana Hernandez Crespo Gonstead at St. Thomas in her reviews of the book. All of these, of the first goals, we also framed the book around justice. And we're not talking about the general term. There are at least 35 definitions of justice across multiple disciplines that I found when writing about designing justice in 2008. Let's go to the next slide. So when we think about justice from the restorative standpoint, or we think about justice in the framework of dispute system design, courts don't tend to define the term much. We talk about fairness and justice, but I want to give you now a way of thinking about what we should be teaching students in our law schools about analyzing context, not just digging down into the rules in a little itty bitty action arena, okay? So let's look at the Ferguson United States Department of Justice report on the Department of Police in Ferguson. And let's look at it through the lens of accountability literature in the field of public management, public administration, and public affairs. So I'm citing two different streams of literature, that report, and then a number of papers on accountability by Dubnik and others. This chart reflects Dubnik's argument that there are 6 promises that the public officials and bureaucrats and police and courts and judges make to the public as part of their accountability to the public. So those 6 promises are 2 columns. They're promises as to the means and mechanisms that the governance structures will use to enforce accountability. And then there are 3 promises about the ends and the outcomes and the virtues that will be produced through these accountability structures. So let's think about this in terms of the action arena of Ferguson writ large, okay? And very quickly walk through it. So inputs in Ferguson, we have police departments The police departments empower the police, along with the local government, empower the police to enforce violations of law. Well, local government directed police to up their arrest rate and to up their fines for minor infractions, because after the Great Recession, there was a drop in fees and tax receipts for local government and state government, and they had to make up the revenue. There were state tax cuts and limits on local, for example, real estate taxes for local government. How do we raise revenue? Well, we have the police evaluated based on how many arrests they make, how many citations they issue, how many infractions. Well, what are the easiest infractions to issue citations for? Little things wrong with cars, like a broken light or registration, little things wrong with the housing code, like having a couch on the front porch. Now, who are likely statistically to commit these? They're more likely to be arrests for people in the lower income bracket, which are predominantly people, Black people, people of color, brown people, BIPOC people. So that's one area of inputs. Let's move down to the promise of ethical behavior. Well, the police make arrests, and those are subject to review in the courts. And the courts, in theory, ought to be enforcing ethical behavior by the police. But when these cases go up to the municipal court in Ferguson, they go up and people don't show up. Why don't they show up? Because if they show up, they have to pay a fine. And if they are people in a lower income class, they may not be able to pay the fine. And if they're not able to pay the fine and they don't show up, then they're held in contempt of court. And if they're held in contempt of court, they could actually be arrested and put in jail in the by the Ferguson Municipal Court and fined another fine by the Ferguson Municipal Court for not showing up and not paying the previous fine. So here's a process that doesn't necessarily make the police accountable. It simply is a revenue enhancing system for the courts. Let's go to the outcomes. Well, what are the outcomes of this system from the standpoint of mechanisms? We have collection of revenue to support government performance of the police as measured by the city, and to some extent the courts. Let's go to the virtues. What were we supposed to be promising in terms of outcomes? We were supposed to be promising integrity. Well, police acting within their technical authority, they had the legal authority to do this. The Department of Justice report finds it was biased enforcement. We promise, in terms of accountability, legitimacy, and democracy. The investigation by the Department of Justice found that there was underrepresentation by race in elected officials. Why is that? We have at every nested level of institutions, local, state, and national, we have the design of various districts gerrymandered. So in local government, it's common to have packing and fracking. We either pack all the people of color and Black people into one district so they have only one representative, or we crack the district and spread it out into multiple other districts so that they cannot achieve a majority and elect a representative. So we've got underrepresentation in elected office, in police hiring, and then we've got convictions that disenfranchise voters. So we have underrepresentation in the electorate. Finally, we have a promise of justice and equity. But if we've got systemic violation of civil rights through this structure, this system, and discrimination by class and race, then where's the justice and equity? Let's go to the next slide. So I'm finally circling around to transformative mediation at the Postal Service, and here's where I have to tell another story. And that is that when I first began conversations with the Postal Service, they had just signed a race discrimination class action lawsuit settlement in the Florida Panhandle. And I was looking to interview them about their dispute resolution program. They were looking for someone to evaluate it. And they came down and met me in Dallas, Texas at a conference of the Society for Professionals of Dispute Resolution, then, which is now the Association for Conflict Resolution, which has recognized Sharon Press's work. At that time, when we talked about it, there was no money involved. I was happy to get data because I had been getting data for the AAA, but that access to that was actually terminated after the repeat player papers. And the notion of how to evaluate this, it struck me as procedural justice, organizational justice, two more definitions of justice, was the easy way in. And we talked about how easy it would be to collect exit surveys. But what they would not let me collect was any data on the exit surveys about demographics, about gender, race, color, ethnicity, national origin, any of that. I couldn't collect it as to the individual complainants. Now, or the respondents. I was getting exit surveys from everybody, including their lawyers and representatives. I ended up with 276,000 exit surveys over a 12-year period. Well, one becomes more and more aware of one's own racism and systemic racism through the process of research and analyzing systems. And it became apparent to me after 2006, when I was no longer under any kind of contract with the Postal Service, I realized that there were 2 years of data where we had data about the purview of the claim, the discrimination purview. Was it a race discrimination claim, a reverse race discrimination claim, a sex discrimination claim? And we could use that as a proxy variable for the complainant's demographics. So we looked at representative bureaucracy, and there's a whole bunch of literature in public affairs about representative bureaucracy. The idea is that government should be hiring people who overall are representative of the population that government serves. And there's passive representation just in terms of raw demographics. There's symbolic representation, the notion that the more Black police we have, the more people will trust the police department. And then there's active representation, which is the notion that bureaucrats actually can try to affect policy. And there is research data on this, proving that if you have critical mass in a police department, for example, you have enough women, and women who are the victim of sexual assault can go to female police officers, you will see female police officers not only symbolically and passively representing other women, or trans people, or people anywhere on the spectrum of gender, but you will see changes in policy. In terms of race and police departments, my colleague at O'Neill has published papers showing you need to get up to 40% population in terms of representative bureaucracy in the police department before you really start to see changes and evidence of policy outcomes in police departments. Next slide.
Yeah, Professor, I just want to check in because I have a litany of kind of questions and answers that are queuing up here. So we need to
One more minute.
quickly, but yes, I do want you to finish. I'm wrapped, so I hate to do this. But
I know I'm probably over time. Skip this slide. We don't need it. Okay, and everybody, I'm assuming everybody in this audience knows the EEO process. and just for your information, the redress process kicked in. The Postal Service, all federal agencies have to have their own internal EEO counselor, and the USPS is a federal organization. So it had its own internal EEO process before it went out to the EEOC with a formal complaint. And they had mediation kick in 2 to 4 weeks after an EEO complaint was filed. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is the only data slide you look at. So we actually tried to determine if we have exit surveys from complainants and we know what the purview was, we can separate out exit surveys alleging race discrimination, and then we can look at their satisfaction with the process, the mediators, and the outcome, and see if there's any difference based on the race of the mediator. And we had the race of the mediators because we did a survey of mediators on a 3,000 person roster, and a number of people self-identified their demographics and self-identified their race. And so we were able, by the code of the mediator and the zip code of the case and the date of the case on the exit survey, to match these cases. And this is what we got. And the one thing I want you to look at, most of the numbers that you see that are not in bold, there's no statistically significant difference when somebody alleging race discrimination has a Black mediator. But there's one, you see those bold numbers? Those are numbers that represent the overall outcome index. That is, all of the other 4 columns put together into one column is the outcome index. And the outcome overall, which was a separate question, how satisfied are you? Highly satisfied, not satisfied, or dissatisfied, highly dissatisfied. And generally speaking, 92% of the complainants were either satisfied or highly satisfied with the process and the mediators, and 62% were satisfied with the outcome overall. But when you look at this, why would it be that you would have people less satisfied with the outcome with an African-American mediator? Well, it's neutrality. If you have to be neutral as a mediator, because that's what the code of conduct says, then that limits your capacity to actively represent, in representative bureaucracy, the complainant. And also, it may simply be, you're doing your job. You're an excellent mediator subscribing to neutrality, but the complainant may expect you to understand their life and their experience at the Postal Service, which has a culture that's a little quasi-military. And it's very top down, right? So you would expect as the complainant to be understood, but you might have a mediator that can't communicate that without fearing that they will be seen as not being neutral. And my last slide is just about the work I'm doing now, but we can save that later. I'm done.
Great. Thank you, Professor. I want to open it up to the other panelists to kind of comment either on the work of the other folks, or I will start peppering you with questions. I so appreciate, Professor Amsler, that you brought in structures, methodologies. The OSTRA model is something I will now be looking up and using. It's pretty powerful. And empirical research is always just deeply satisfying. So thank you for the hard work that goes into that, because I know it is hard work. I'd like to turn it to Professor Gunning and just ask you, as you heard the other speakers, if anything else has come to mind or anything that you specifically want to comment upon, and then we'll move into some of our questions.
Oh, wow.
It's a big open-ended question, and I can give you a more specific one if you prefer.
Yeah, do something more specific. Although I have to say that I enjoyed what both Professor Mamo and Amsler had to say. And like you, I will be looking up this Onstrom approach, which I think, gives us a framework, a structure to actually look at the various systems that we said we want to implement. So I really appreciate that. And of course, I appreciate Professor Mamo's very, very thick, but also really helpful walk through the implications for Professor Bell. May he rest in peace. He was a wonderful, wonderful friend and colleague. Interest conversion theory. It raises all of the complications that Derek himself recognized in doing racial justice work. And it's an important reminder as we go forward.
Well, I'll ask you a specific question, but just on that point, in Professor Mamo's article, he talks about how Fisher and Bell, they were both at Harvard. They had this friendship, which I think there's a whole book in there too that could be written. So, Professor Gunning, one of the things that you do claim is the role of mediator. As a practitioner of divorce community mediation models, as well as many others that you've been involved in. How has your own conception of neutrality changed over the last, let's say, period of time since you've written the article? Or has it changed? Is it evolving? One of the things I loved about your comments were, you talked about how your discernment, you were bringing in more and more discernment and evolving as a scholar, but how has your notion of neutrality evolved as a practitioner?
It's an interesting question. And I mean, part of what's coming to me is, as I said in my basic talk, is I sort of move from, I see there's a general reminder that we have something else coming up, so let me try to be quick, from the more individual focus to community. And so I just want to mention the community dialogue process, because I feel a bit more confident there that a lot of the more standard notions about neutrality really need to be examined. So one of the things, and I had hoped that Professor Mamo and I might be able to talk a little bit about his own principles of dialogue and all of that, and how he saw bringing in a systems focus. So I'll say this, one of the things that in trust talks they did was before we actually engaged in, and there were a series of dialogues, the idea was to hopefully have the same people who are all stakeholders in downtown continue a conversation, which I think is a fabulous approach, because there was an arc, right, in terms of where we were going. But one of the things that was done was there were always presentations. So for example, before one of the early ones, we had the fabulous Kelly Little Hernandez, who, for those of you here, certainly in LA, I know that you know her, she's at UCLA, she's fabulous, she's a MacArthur genius, all of that stuff. And I think she just got inducted into some terrific academy. She's a historian specifically around race in Los Angeles as it affects prisons and law enforcement. And she spoke about that, right? So that the idea that we would just sort of walk in cold, whatever ideas the participants might have had when they come in about their life experiences that might be just like everybody else's life experience, we don't stay with that. We educate people, right? We start, and I think this is really particularly important now, where we have such a conflict over what's a fact, what's factual information, how do you talk about evidence-based decision-making? So I think it becomes even more important to the extent that it would be perceived as a violation of neutrality. And I had some debates with people, other facilitators, around how we were going to work with this information that was presented beforehand. I think it's important because there are a lot of things that people don't understand about the history of their very own communities, and we need to introduce that kind of factual information in the process.
Well, and you talked about talking with Professor Mamo about what he's proposes. So let's picking up on that, to the extent that you assert that, you know, neutrality is a function of whiteness. It is necessarily defined by whiteness. How do you protect against that in the dialogue processes that you're using in the structure of dialogue that you propose? So Professor Mammal, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So yeah, I can jump in. And I mean, for me, one of the key things is just really developing, I think, a level of comfort with the idea of difference and disagreement and so forth. And in part that comes out of just that, you know, we have a basic recognition that, you know, if we're at the mediation table or in a negotiation or something like that, that differences are generative. If we have different interests or different resources or different priorities or preferences, then that enables us to, you know, make trades, create value, all that good stuff. And that in some ways, that kind of impulse is really driving how I think about dialogues, that if we're going to live together, we need to really understand and appreciate the depth of the differences that we have, as well as learning about what is shared, what are the places where we can actually come to some understanding, but also, and I think the phrase from the first panel that Professor Von Guzman mentioned was this right to opacity, that in some cases there might be limitations on what we're able to share, what we're able to understand of what other people are sharing and so forth, and that's okay, that we're not kind of forcing some kind of understanding or trying to get in people's heads and force some kind of reconciliation or some transformation or anything like that. My goals are more modest in really just trying to have folks understand the ways in which they're viewing or in approaching a particular conflict or a particular set of issues, and recognizing and learning a bit about the different frameworks and models and so forth that others might be bringing, and really just starting to recognize that there is this faceted way of viewing the world, of engaging the world, that assuming that we're all operating in good faith, that we still have those differences, and that really our task is to learn from that, to find ways of figuring out how to move forward in light of that.
Mm-hmm. It's been kind of a theme today. So rather than creating value, creating, and then I'd like to hear if other people have thoughts. If there's a rewrite of the interest-based computational model, you know, we're creating what instead?
Yeah, so I know that we previously talked about interests, and are they necessarily part of that kind of economizing sort of model? And I mean, I think that interests are, you know, certainly important in the interest-based model, of course, as creating that measure of a party's value, so they can evaluate different kinds of proposals and figure out what works for them, what works for the other side, and so forth. And so what else, I guess the question is really, what else can we do with interests other than that kind of move of creating value and becoming, you know, rational maximizers and so forth? And I think that there's really also a question of communication, I suppose, of trying to really decipher, by thinking about interests, by understanding our own interests, which is itself a hard task, as well as the interests of others, where we're coming from, where the other is coming from, what we've been doing and trying to accomplish, as well as what the other has been trying to accomplish, what's motivating them and so forth, and how we're both seeing the problem perhaps differently, and really, I think, coming to some understanding of the problem space. I mean, I guess sort of more broadly, I think less about problem solving and more about problem finding or problem articulation. That, at least in my experience, the initial articulations of the problem is rarely what we end up with after we've had some time to really think through the issue.
In different ways, I think, well, first, certainly Professor Bernard kind of talked about that, and in different ways, the first three panelists as well. I did say to Andrew at one point in preparing, you know, that as an institutionalist and also as a white woman who's trying to kind of examine my privilege, letting go of interest identification is painful. Letting go of interest-based bargaining is not. But is there something recuperable there? So he's trying to speak to that. Aparna, you have a thought, and I'd like to ask a question.
First, thank you to everyone. This has just been an amazingly complex discussion, but I've loved like every second as we've moved through the different panelists' remarks. I know we have to turn it over to Professor Singh soon, but one of the things that I take away from this, and I think each of you identified it in your remarks in different ways, is the individual dispute and the community disputes, right? And I think, addressing bias within the individual sphere has, each of you has done different work on that in that area. And then trying to move that and move and take action in the social justice sphere with those individual biases in mind to connect to the movements is a separate sort of separate journey. And I think ADR can really allow the individual disputes and the biases and help connect people, communities through facilitated dialogue to the community aspect of movement building that we are all trying to actually get to for the symposium. It's less, if we had time, I'd love for you to comment and sort of talk a little bit more about that, but I do want to keep our program moving and express just deep gratitude to each of you and the thoughts that you've illuminated in our whole community.
I'll just add that we just had a comment in the chat where someone is proposing, Chuck Crumpton is proposing that we take all the insights into account and develop a new approach. And each of these elements is, I think each of our speakers today brought a really important and new element. I'll just close by saying we have to move on, but if one of you thinks, what's the most important research question of the day? What's the most, I wonder if you can answer, and that's a sentence long. What's the most important research question of the day in this area or in your work? Okay, well then we're going to move on, and when you think of it, put it in the chat. Okay, so thank you all so much. It's been an honor to sit with you and just to kind of marinate in the brilliance. Professor Singh.
Thank you to all the terrific panelists. I appreciate Professor Gunning, Professor Amsler, Professor Mamo, and above all also Professor Stephanie Blondell. And thank you for the terrific panel. Folks, we are moving on to our last segment. We have about half an hour, 29 minutes. We would like to stay on time. And I have a treat for you reserved here for the end. It is Judge Daniel Weinstein is going to make a special announcement and give you some special comments. And before he does that, let me do injustice to his bio because I'm going to be very brief. He is our nation's top preeminent mediator of complex civil disputes and pioneer in our development of mediation, becoming one of the founders of the JAMS Institute, and who still works and mediates and is managing some very, very complex cases. I'll also mention to you, he is the recipient of 2014 International Peace Advocate for Peace Award from Cardozo. And then he's also the recipient of 2020 Straus Institute for Dispute Resolution Peacemaker Award. Is our highest honor. He's also on our faculty. He is a distinguished mediator in residence. I can go on and on, but I'll stop here. I can tell you, I had a pleasure of co-teaching advanced mediation with him. And our students were asking, Professor Singh, we don't care about you, but tell us when Judge Danny is teaching next. So it's intimidating to co-teach with him. Judge Danny, welcome. I know you are in travels. You found time to connect with us. Can you hear us? Okay.
I apologize for the acoustics. I hope you can hear me. I am traveling. I'm in the middle of an airport in Mexico, and the miracles of modern technology at least allowed me to connect, and I apologize. But when I got the chance to give an award for a champion of diversity to one of my hidden heroes from afar, who I really don't know, but have been hearing about for years and admired from a distance, I jumped at it even while I'm traveling and trying to keep all the documents together. But I was, we're all looking in this world of conflict resolution, diversity, access to justice, the important themes that all of us are dedicating our careers to in one way or another. And especially looking for people who themselves are models of developing their own consciousness, developing their own abilities, searching for ways in which they can be better and learn more about themselves, that they can then be much more effective in teaching others. So the person that I'm honored to give this award to is a model of that. And that's why I've admired him so far. And he's used the weapon, I will say, of civility as his trademark. Something that is awfully hard for all of us to adhere to. But, and I could talk about all his degrees. He has more degrees than a thermometer and more distinguished articles. And he was, of course, the dean of George Washington and of Wake Forest, and served with distinction there. But really, what I think we're honoring is because of the individual that he is and of his model of civility in the work that he's done. And I was interested to learn that he learned that not from some school book or on Zoom, but he learned it from his mom, who probably both taught it and then enforced it. And he learned it as an Eagle Scout. He learned it in the military, where he proudly served the country proudly. This is a real guy who learned that you can do a lot of things with force and conviction, but you can do it with civility. And I've always admired I have a pretty good temper and somewhat of a short fuse. I've always admired models of civility. So Blake Morin, I just want to tell you, you are the real deal. And I am very, very honored in this little airport in Mexico to be able to be the person to give you the champion of diversity. And we really do need champions like you. So I look forward to lifting a glass with you with great civility, in the future in person. But for now, bravo to you. You are a model to all of us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Judge Weinstein. Thank you for taking the time out during your travels to do this and to say all of those wonderfully kind comments. You know, when you hear these things, you go, when did they read my mother's diary? You know, so, and fortunately, they didn't read the part where she said, I had to get on to do his homework.
If that's the worst you did, you're way ahead of all of us.
Bless your heart. Well, thank you.
You are indeed a champion, and thank you for your leadership.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you. And I look forward to that drink together. Let's make that happen.
Oh, yeah. No, we'll be on the campus a lot in the coming year.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Cheers.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for this wonderful award. And I would be remiss if I didn't, first of all, just thank the Straus Institute for dispute resolution, not only for this award, but for all of the wonderful work that you do. And I'm going to comment on that in just a little bit. And I know we've had a very, very enriching time in this particular space in terms of all of the wonderful presentations that you've had. And so I'm not going to elongate that, except to say that I am grateful to the Institute for the work that it does. I'm very, very appreciative to Ms. Gupta and to Professor Singh, not only for all of their shepherding of a lot of what the Institute does, but their patience with me. I'm currently teaching contracts as a distinguished visitor for Pepperdine, which has been a wonderful experience. But this was the last week of class, and they had to track me down. And once they did, I'm so grateful that you did. I am thoroughly honored by this. Let me just say this. We have heard from so many wonderful scholars, teachers, professionals in this particular space of ADR and what it means. And it is so important to remember that the elements of ADR are a critical part of our landscape in American legal education. I have said that from the time that I joined the Academy. Many of you don't know I was a practitioner for a number of years before I became an academic. And I always remembered that in order for the theory to have any kind of applicability or any kind of true doctrinal importance to our students, you have to marry that with what they're going to see when they get outside to have to practice these variety of different things. And certainly ADR does that in a very special way and in a realistic way. It also has this important nexus to social justice. And if we look at this historically, we think of one of the key central figures in social justice in the United States, certainly in the 20th century, and his aura still remains, and that is the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And we're all familiar with him. Students, even today, even though they weren't alive during this time, when you think of social justice, his image becomes very real. One of the things that you may not remember of all the quotable quotes he's had was one that he had at the time that he was protesting all of the virulent segregation that took place in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And as he was talking about his nonviolent movement in terms of effectuating social change, he made this pronouncement while he was really focused on changing the landscape of race relations and also bigotry that was rampant in 1963, particularly in Birmingham, after you had George Wallace proclaiming the permanence of segregation. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said this on the eve of all of those protests, that the purpose of our direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. You seldom hear that quote with so many others that he's made, but note that you see he recognized the nexus between social change and negotiation. This idea of getting people to sit down, people of different persuasions, different ideas, different ideologies, different backgrounds, to sit down and talk about what was important in order to advance society. This is imperative for us, not only as educators, but as lawyers. The historic function of lawyers, and I've got to say, in 2003, I studied all of this when I was granted the opportunity to give the Thomas More commemorative lecture at St. Dunstan's Church in Canterbury, England. I had to do all of this research because I was the first American to do it, and I didn't want to blow it for future Americans who'd want to do it. So I did all of this research to think about what made Thomas More so special over 500 years ago as this quintessential lawyer that basically looked at principle as well as duty. And one of the things that I discovered in looking at that is that a truly professional lawyer is not just one who represents her client in a very zealous way. It's also someone who looks for opportunities to build bridges in society for other individuals. That is at the heart of what we should do as lawyers and as professionals. And the tenets of ADR do just that, this idea of building bridges. I love during this whole program of hearing how individuals who are in this field are professional neutrals. That is a huge type of characterization because it is exactly what we need right now in our polarized society of what we're dealing with, and getting people to understand that there are going to be different ideologies, but we need to talk to each other in a civil space And what better way to do that than with individuals who understand how to bring people together in a civil space as a neutral individual to get people to exchange their views in a productive way. Legal education stands at the forefront of this. And I'm so passionate about this in a way that sort of suggests that professionals, if we're creating them the right way, we have to have in our curriculum the importance of the elements that ADR brings so that individuals that we graduate are skilled enough as counselors to be able to be those individuals who bring people together and bridge those gaps to have very good solutions. I heard earlier, and I'm not sure which one of the speakers said this, of how ADR is being relegated in American legal education, which disturbs me greatly, because one of the things that I've also tried to recognize and push, that there's a nexus between the doctrinal courses and the doctrinal information that we portray, and the skills that are necessary in order for our students to go out and apply those doctrinal concepts. They go hand in hand. And unfortunately, our profession is one that has been stayed by the Langdellian model for so long that breaking down these artificial barriers remains a critical component. But if we're going to produce professionals who can go out in today's world, which is more global than it's ever been before, where they are able to do their craft, to bring individuals together, to make those bridges, they've got to have both components, and they are compatible. One of the things that I've also promoted was this idea of not only enriching the curriculum with ADR courses, but that we tell our doctrinal faculty members, you should be incorporating elements of ADR in your own courses. Now, as dean of 2 law schools, I can say this and they'll say, what experience do you have with this? You're saying we should do it. What experience do you have? Well, I am very well armed for that particular question, because one of the things that I've recognized when I teach many of my courses is that most of the students in law school have only been acquainted with the adversarial model. This idea that everything ends up in court and there's a decision maker and there's a zero-sum game and one person loses and another wins. And we all know that over 95% of the matters that go into litigation end up settling in some way. That was certainly my experience when I was a practitioner. And I brought that attitude to the classroom. So here's what I do, and this is what I say to my colleagues. Why not, in some way, investigate having some kind of exercise in your own classes that encourages the students to understand that bringing people together and having discussions to settle a particular matter is the optimal way of coming to a solution that is effective and also one that carries with it a better solution. So in all of my classes, and particularly in my contracts class, I divide the class up into various groups. I give them a party and I have them do this one thing. I'll have them talk for at least 6 or 7 weeks throughout the course to see if they can come to some understanding to resolve the problem that I've given them. And what I oftentimes will say is that if you come to some kind of settlement, then you ought to write a settlement agreement that spells out all of the various terms or requisites of that agreement. However, if you can't come to a settlement, everyone in the class must write a 2-page summary as to why it didn't work. I have implemented that for a number of years. I have never had a class not settle their particular matter. And on my evaluations, I oftentimes will say, I can't understand why Professor Morant would have us do this, but now I do get it. And I went in there at first thinking, I'm going in for blood. I'm not going to take anything less. And then at the end, I sort of recognized that in order for my client to perhaps get something of value out of this, I had to recognize the value of the other side so that we could come to a mutually agreeable solution. And while I've done that every single time when I've had my evaluations and I see that, I know that I have now implanted in this student this idea that solving problems through a way of really getting people to talk to each other is going to be the supreme value of being a lawyer. I think these kinds of methodologies are critical for us in terms of advancing this, and to show that it has a nexus with our responsibility as lawyers to promote the rule of law, to promote access for those who don't have it, to ensure that the individual tenets of social justice are not just things that enrich the possibilities for those who've been disadvantaged, but it enriches society as a whole, that we're all interdependent. And so as a result of that, recognizing that particular notion enriches our abilities as professionals, and it furthers society. Let me close with this. When I was at Wake Forest University, I had the esteemed pleasure to serve as dean at the law school during the time that the great Dr. Maya Angelou was on the faculty. And she invited my wife and me and several of my colleagues over to her house for dinner. It was an incredible evening where we were sharing our narratives about our lives and our profession. At one point, Dr. Angelou made a comment that I now quote whenever I have the opportunity to speak on subjects such as social justice, and certainly this avenue of talking with each other and building bridges. And this is what Dr. Angelou said. We have many commonalities, regardless of the walks of life that we go through. We have many commonalities. And those commonalities often are more numerous than our differences. But we have this tendency to focus on our differences more. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we educate our students to understand that getting people to focus on their commonalities is a great way for us to advance social justice? Ladies and gentlemen, that quote has never left me, and I leave that with you today, that what you are doing, all of what you are doing, is a valuable construct in what I see as the truly professional lawyer of the 21st century. Thank you so much for this award. I don't know if you can see it over my right shoulder. It's kind of small back there, but it's sitting up there prominently. I'm so grateful for it. Every time that I see it, it will remind me of my duties to advance that. And I wish the Straus Institute great success going forward. Thank you so much.
Professor Moran, would you pick up the award for a second if you can? Okay, thank you.
So, can you see it?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. So
it has a little bit of glare with all these ring lights going on, but hopefully you can see it. It is so very lovely. It will occupy a very cherished part of my office and being. And again, I'm thrilled to pieces with this. Thank you for reinforcing what I have believed in my own pedagogy for so long. And I wish you the very best as you continue your very noble work.
Professor Moran, on behalf of the Straus Institute, Pepperdine Caruso School of Law, our colleagues at all other amazing universities who are here today, Weinstein International Foundation, from JAMS, we're just so pleased you accepted this award and you gave us your time to speak to us. This has been please continue your work and please guiding us and mentor people like us. Sir, we have a short remarks by our Dean of Students Life Diversity and Belonging, Ms. Shala Richards, who knows you quite well. Ms. Richards, are you here?
She sure does.
I am here. Thank you, Professor Singh. And before I speak to Dean Moran, I want to say thank you to, as many already have, to you, Professor Singh, to Aparna Gupta, to I know the hard workers behind the scenes, Rowley, Professor Blondell, Lori Rushford, to Shelley Warrens, Randy Redman, and this is why you shouldn't name people, Debbie Jasmine, and all of the hard workers in the Straus Institute, who I know worked tirelessly to pull this day together. And it has been a truly powerful day. I mean, and as I was listening from this morning, when we were reminded that belonging begins with creating a place of safety, all the way through to the conversations on curriculum and being reminded of the foundations of those like Derek Bell. And then even Professor Moran, you're just reminding us of the wise words of Maya Angelou. You know, what rang through as I knew that you were receiving this award was how each of those sections reminded me of you, Dean Moran, that you have strove to create the law as a place of safety for young lawyers, practitioners, people in the legal academy, administrators, and that whether we knew you personally or not, knowing that you existed meant that for others of us, this place was a place of safety where we could imagine a sense of belonging before it became the word du jour, right? Before we moved into it, there was an ideology and a pedagogy that informed your research and informed your interactions that said, don't listen to anyone who says this isn't a place for you, because it is. Absolutely. And we have appreciated your being with us as a distinguished visiting professor this semester. But even before that, I remember the first time I met you in person, because I had been reading your works before then, was last February, when you and your wonderful wife were on campus and you were hosting for us a Black History Month panel.
That's right.
Speaking about belonging and diversity. And I was a little nobody to the school and ran up to you and said, Miranda, it's such a pleasure for you to be here. And I just hope to be able to get to know you more. And you and your wife both spent such valuable minutes encouraging me in my own professional journey. And then you came back as a visiting professor. And I have heard from countless students the time you've taken, the care you've poured into them, how much they've enjoyed being in your classes, but also the pleasure that we've had of having you. I believe throughout this semester, these brief 3-4 months, you've been on no less than 3 or 4 panels, one of which I roped you into, and I think 2 others that I said, just call Dean Morant, he'll definitely. And you did, so blame me, Mrs. Morant, for the hours that your husband did. It's all my fault for telling others to call me. But because we knew that you all had such a generous heart, and it goes to the heart of this award, that you truly champion diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and what you said, that we see the value in each person and what they bring to the law. It is such an example for all of us to follow. May all of our graduates from all of the institutions represented here aspire to create such places, because then, like you said, we will not only be professional lawyers, we will be excellent attorneys. So thank you for all you all do. And to the Straus Institute.
Thank you so much, Chalik. That was just, I should say, I'm just so overwhelmed by the commentary, but thank you so much. And it's been such an enriching pleasure to be part of this community, and virtual though it has been, that has not dampened the enrichment that I have received. So thank you so much for this opportunity. This will not be the last that we have this engagement, and that would be my privilege.
I'm going to hand it over to Aparna Gupta. Thank you, sir, for accepting our award. Thank you for all you do and all you're going to continue to do. I want to thank everyone for coming today. This is, I know it's a long day. I know we are getting tired of Zoom. Thank you for giving us this chance. Thank you for just being with us today. We appreciate your presence on behalf of the entire team, and we have a large team. If I take names, it'll be my colleague Adr Critics did the best, and I appreciate everyone's presence. Lastly, I want to thank Ms. Aparna Gupta. As you can see, she's the person behind the scene who worked the hardest to make this symposium happen. And I'm gonna leave with her the last comment she'll make to close us all. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everyone. You know, when we started thinking about this symposium, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, you know, it came from the young people, and it came from the youth in demanding that our profession connect back to the movement, support them in their movement and in our movement. And, as we were thinking, as we went through the panels today, I couldn't help but feel that we all are going to make progress in our own individual spheres. But if there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us, is that there's so much value in collective action, and the action that we all take over the next day or two, the next week or two, the next year or two. And I know on one of the panel calls, I can't remember which one, earlier in the week, we said, oh, what a week to be having this symposium, right? When we planned it, 4 or 5 months in advance, we had no idea that this is the week we would inherit. But I also think that every week is almost like this week. Every week it's turning into where there are issues that need our attention every day, every month, every year. And so I'm just thrilled and delighted that the panelists have really woken us up and given us a framework to begin to do this work. And the Straus Institute is really deeply committed to getting into our communities with our students, with our faculty, rolling up our sleeves and connecting to the movement, connecting and supporting the organizations that are already doing some of the work. And so this is not goodbye, even though, we've been on, I feel like you're my new best friends because I've seen you for about 4 hours now, but it's really a call to continue to engage over the next, months or so. And we hope to continue these conversations with each and every one of you in your various capacities, and are just deeply, deeply grateful to you for joining us today. So thank you so much.
We are on time. Wow. Okay, great. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everyone. See you soon. Be safe.